Hey guys, welcome back to Sleep into Power. I am NJ. Tonight we're traveling back into the extraordinary world of the Vikings. Before we begin, if you're enjoying these documentaries and you'd like to support the channel, you can purchase my book, Sleep into Power, available in paperback and Kindle, using the links below. You can also support the channel through Buy Me a Coffee if you'd like to help me continue creating these documentaries. You'll also find Sleep into Power on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major podcast platforms if you enjoy listening away from YouTube. Now, get comfortable, lower the lights, relax, and let's journey back through time together. Before the first oar touches the water, I want to say thank you. This channel has grown into something I never quite expected, and it has grown because of you, because of the people who leave a comment at 2 a.m, who send a suggestion, who tell me that a documentary helped them through a difficult night. Tonight's subject was asked for more times than almost any other, and to the person who wrote to me about it 3 separate times, patiently, kindly, without ever pushing, this one is for you. And to those of you who have been here since the very beginning, quietly returning night after night, you know who you are. Thank you, wherever you are in the world right now, whatever the hour is where you are lying, whether it is late evening in London or the small hours in Sydney, whether the sun is going down over the Pacific coast or rain is falling somewhere in Northern Europe, you are welcome here. Let the room grow dark, let your breathing slow. There is nowhere else you need to be. We are going somewhere cold. Picture a coastline at the top of the world, a place where the land does not so much end as fracture. Grey rock rises straight out of black water. Long arms of sea reach inland for 60, 80, 100 miles, cutting between cliffs that climb higher than any cathedral spire would ever climb. These are the fjords of Norway, carved by glaciers over hundreds of thousands of years, drowned by the rising sea when the ice at last let go. Waterfalls thread down the rock faces in white ribbons. Pine forest clings to whatever soil it can find. In the shallows, the water is so clear that you can see the pale stones on the bottom, and so cold that it takes the breath from your chest. Turn eastward, and the country changes its character entirely. Sweden opens out into forest, thousands upon thousands of square miles of spruce and birch and pine, broken by lakes so numerous that no one has ever counted them all with any confidence. In summer, the light lingers there until midnight and beyond, a soft blue dusk that never quite becomes darkness. In winter, the lakes freeze hard enough to carry a sledge, and the forest falls into a silence so complete that a branch cracking half a mile away sounds close enough to touch. Further south, Denmark is a different world again. Low, gentle, green, a peninsula and a scattering of islands laid out like stepping stones between the Baltic and the North Sea. Nowhere in Denmark is more than about 50 kilometers from salt water. The soil is good there, better than almost anywhere else in the north, and the beech woods grow thick, and the wind comes off the sea across fields that roll rather than rise. If Norway is vertical and Sweden is deep, Denmark is wide and open and turned outward towards the world. 3 landscapes then, and 3 different kinds of life. Yet all of them shared one thing, and that one thing shaped everything that followed. The sea was not a barrier, the sea was the road. Consider what it meant to live in Western Norway 1,000 years ago, or 2,000. To reach a neighboring valley on foot, you might have to climb over a mountain shoulder, cross a glacier field, descend through forest, and ford a river swollen with meltwater. The journey could take days. To reach that same valley by boat, you simply pushed off from the shingle and followed the water. What was almost impossible by land was easy by sea. Whole communities, therefore, faced the water rather than the interior. Their doors opened towards the shore. Their wealth floated at anchor. Their children learned to read the weather and the swell before they learned to read anything else, and long before there was a written language in the north for them to read at all. This is the first thing to understand about the people we call the Vikings. They did not become sailors because they were restless. They became sailors because the geography of their homeland made the sea the only sensible way to live, and then, over many centuries, they became rather better at it than anyone else in Europe. Climate mattered just as much. Scandinavia sits at a latitude that ought, by rights, to be locked in ice for much of the year. Northern Norway lies at the same distance from the equator as the middle of Greenland, and yet the fjords there rarely freeze. The reason is the great current of warm water that flows up from the tropics across the Atlantic, brushing the coast of Britain and carrying on north along Norway. Without it, none of this history happens. With it, the coastal strip stays open, the fishing stays good, and farming becomes possible far further north than seems reasonable. Even so, life was a negotiation with the cold. The growing season in much of Norway and Sweden was short, sometimes only 3 or 4 months. Barley ripened late and unreliably. A summer that turned wet at the wrong moment could ruin the harvest, and a ruined harvest meant a winter of thin porridge and slaughtered livestock and hunger by February. Farms were therefore small, self-sufficient and cautious. Every household stored what it could. Every household knew, in a way that is difficult for us to feel now, that survival was seasonal and never guaranteed. Against that background, a curious rhythm developed. Winter was the season of the indoors, of repair and craft and storytelling, of long nights around a hearth in a smoky hall. Summer was the season of movement. Once the fields were sown, and before the harvest came in, there was a window of weeks when young men in particular had time on their hands and a boat in the water. That window, in the end, would change the history of Europe. Nothing about it was inevitable, though, and it is worth resisting the temptation to draw a straight line from the fjords to the raiders. Many peoples have lived on difficult coasts without terrorizing a continent. What happened in Scandinavia was a combination of geography, technology, politics, and timing, and each of those elements arrived at its own pace, some of them slowly, over 1,000 years and more. So let us go further back still, long before any sail was seen off the coast of England. Human beings had been living in Scandinavia since the ice retreated, following the reindeer herds north as the glaciers withdrew and the tundra greened. By the Bronze Age, roughly 1,500 years before the Common Era, there were settled farming communities across Denmark and southern Sweden, and they were far from isolated. Bronze itself tells us so. Making bronze requires copper and tin, and neither metal occurs in usable quantity in Scandinavia. Every bronze sword, every spiral arm ring, every one of those extraordinary curved horns known as lurs, was made from metal that had traveled north through a chain of trade reaching down into Central Europe and beyond, some of the tin arriving from as far away as Cornwall. In exchange, the North sent amber, fossilized resin from ancient pine forests, washed up on the beaches of Jutland and the Baltic shore after storms, warm to the touch, glowing like trapped honey when held to the light. Amber from the Baltic has been found in Bronze Age graves in Greece and in the tomb of Tutankhamun. Long before anyone had heard of a Viking, the far north was already connected to the Mediterranean by a thin, persistent thread of trade. Then came iron, and with iron, the north changed shape. Unlike copper and tin, iron could be found locally, not in mines exactly, but in bogs. Across Scandinavia, in the peat and the marshes, iron oxide accumulates in soft brown lumps that can be dug out with a spade, dried, and smelted in a simple clay furnace with charcoal. It is laborious work, and the yield is poor, yet it required no long trade route and no foreign middleman. A community that could find a bog could make its own tools, its own nails, its own axes and blades. Independence of that kind has consequences. From roughly 500 years before the Common Era onwards, settlement spread inland. Forests were cleared with iron axes, and the population slowly grew. Rome, meanwhile, was rising in the south, and the Romans knew that something existed up beyond the Elbe, though their knowledge of it was hazy and largely second-hand. The historian Tacitus, writing at the end of the 1st century, described a people he called the Suiones, who lived on islands in the ocean and were powerful in ships, noting that their vessels had a prow at each end so that they could be beached without turning. It is a small detail, easily passed over, and yet it is a genuine glimpse of the North from the outside, and the double-ended hull he describes would still be recognizable 800 years later. Roman goods traveled north in quantity. Archaeologists have recovered glassware, bronze vessels, coins and fine drinking sets from graves in Denmark and Sweden, far beyond any frontier the legions ever held. Some arrived through trade, some as diplomatic gifts, some as the pay and plunder of northern men who had served in Roman armies and come home again. That last route matters more than it might seem, because it established a pattern that would repeat itself for centuries. Young men from the north went south to fight for wealthy foreign rulers, learned how those rulers organized themselves, and returned carrying both silver and ideas. When the Western Empire came apart in the 5th century, the shock waves reached Scandinavia too. This was the age of great migrations, of Goths and Vandals and Franks and Lombards moving across the ruins of Roman order, and of the Angles, Saxons and Jutes crossing the North Sea to Britain. Some of those Jutes came from the very peninsula that still bears their name. Even at this early stage then, people from the Danish mainland were already crossing open water to settle in England, 3 centuries before the raids began. The sea road was old. The centuries that followed are sometimes called the Vendel period in Sweden and the Merovingian period in Norway, and they are difficult, shadowy, and quietly extraordinary. Written sources are almost non-existent. What survives is in the ground. Helmets of iron with bronze eyebrows and panels showing warriors and dancing figures, garnet-studded harness fittings, and above all boat graves, in which a man was laid out in a vessel with weapons, horses, hunting birds and food for a journey. The great cemeteries at Vendel and Valsgärde in eastern Sweden preserve these burials in astonishing detail, and their contents are so close in style to the Sutton Hoo ship burial in Suffolk that the connection between eastern England and the Baltic in this period is impossible to miss. A discovery on the Estonian island of Saaremaa sharpened the picture further. At a place called Salme, road workers uncovered 2 buried ships containing the remains of more than 40 men, most of them killed violently, buried with fine swords and gaming pieces. Chemical analysis of their teeth suggested they came from central Sweden. The graves date to roughly the middle of the 8th century, several decades before the raid that is traditionally said to open the Viking Age. Whatever those men were doing so far from home, it involved a sailing expedition across the Baltic, high-status weaponry, and a battle that went badly wrong. The impulse that we call Viking was clearly already stirring. What was society like in those centuries? Small is the honest answer, and intensely local. There was no Norway, no Sweden, no Denmark in any sense we would recognize. Instead, there were valleys and islands and stretches of coast, each dominated by a leading family whose head might be called a chieftain, or a petty king, or a jarl, depending on his reach and his self-regard. His authority rested on 3 things: land, generosity, and reputation. He held the best farmland, he fed and armed a band of loyal men, and he gave gifts, lavishly enough that his name traveled. That third element is easy to underestimate. In a society without coinage in general circulation, without writing beyond short runic inscriptions, and without any bureaucracy whatsoever, gold and silver were not simply wealth. They were the visible proof of a man's standing, and their proper use was not to hoard them but to distribute them. a chieftain who gave away arm rings and swords and fine cloth-bound warriors to himself. A chieftain who kept everything for himself, found that his hall emptied. The old poems return to this idea again and again, praising the ring-giver, the generous lord, the breaker of arm rings, because generosity was the currency of loyalty. To sustain that generosity, a leader needed a supply of portable wealth, and the North produced relatively little of it at home. Furs, yes, walrus ivory from the far north, and soapstone, and iron, and slaves. Yet the great concentrations of silver and gold lay elsewhere, in the churches and monasteries and trading towns of Christian Europe, and in the vast bullion economy of the Islamic world further east. The competitive politics of Scandinavia therefore created a permanent, structural hunger for foreign wealth. When a means of reaching that wealth appeared, the pressure to use it was enormous. Religion, too, was taking the form we would later recognize, though it is important to be careful here. What is usually called Norse paganism was not a single organized faith with a scripture, a priesthood, and a settled creed. It was a loose and regionally varied body of practice and story, absorbed in childhood, expressed in seasonal feasts and sacrifices, tied to particular places and particular families. There were sacred groves, sacred springs, sacred stones. Certain gods were more important in some districts than in others. Almost everything we know about it in detail was written down 2 or 3 centuries after it ceased to be practiced, by Christians, in Iceland, and that gap should sit gently in the back of your mind throughout everything that follows. Trade, meanwhile, was becoming organized. During the 8th century, a network of coastal marketplaces grew up around the North Sea and the Baltic. Ribe in western Denmark, founded around the year 705, is the oldest town in Scandinavia. Hedeby appeared at the neck of the Jutland Peninsula, ideally placed to move goods between the 2 seas without the long and dangerous voyage around the north of Denmark. Birka rose on an island in Lake Mälaren in Sweden. Kaupang was established in southern Norway. Across the water at Dorestad in Frisia and Quentavik in northern France, merchants gathered in numbers. These places were noisy, smelly, thrilling and small. Timber houses crammed along narrow lanes, workshops turning out combs of antler and beads of glass, the smell of tar and fish and wood smoke and animal dung, the ring of a hammer on an anvil, coins and hacked silver changing hands, and languages mingling on the wharf. Anyone who spent a season in such a town heard where the wealth of the world was kept, and how well or how badly it was guarded. By the closing decades of the 8th century, then, every ingredient was in place. Ambitious chieftains competing for followers, a hunger for silver, detailed knowledge of foreign coasts gathered through trade, a political neighbor to the south, the expanding Frankish Empire of Charlemagne, whose aggressive campaigns against the pagan Saxons brought Christian armies right up to the Danish border and gave the northern kings something to fear, and, quietly maturing in the boatyards of Norway and Denmark, a piece of technology that would prove to be one of the most consequential inventions of the early medieval world. Before we come to that, though, we should spend a while in the imagination of these people. To understand why a man would climb into an open boat and sail beyond the sight of land, it helps to understand what he believed about the world, about fate, and about what waited for him if he did not come home. Imagine a tree, not a tree in a wood, but the tree, an ash so vast that its branches hold up the sky and its roots run beneath everything that exists. Its name is Yggdrasil. One root reaches down to a well of wisdom, another to a spring where 3 women sit spinning the fates of gods and men, a third into the freezing dark. An eagle sits in the high branches. A serpent gnaws at the roots below. A squirrel runs endlessly up and down the trunk, carrying insults between them, which is a detail that tells you something rather charming about the people who told this story, because even their cosmology had room for a joke. Around and within that tree hang the worlds. Midgard, the middle enclosure, is ours, the world of human beings, ringed by an ocean. Asgard is the stronghold of the gods, joined to Midgard by a burning rainbow bridge. Jotunheim belongs to the giants, that older and wilder race who are not simply monsters but forces, the embodiment of frost and mountain and sea, and everything in nature that does not care whether you live. Beneath lies the realm of the dead, cold and misty, ruled by a figure named Hel. There are worlds of fire and worlds of elves and dwarves in the dark places under the stones. 9 worlds in all, though the sources never quite agree on which 9, which is itself a useful warning about how neat we should expect any of this to be. The universe began, according to the poems, in a gap between fire and ice, where the melting frost formed the first being, a giant. From his body the world was made, his flesh the earth, his blood the seas, his skull the dome of the sky, his brains the clouds. There is nothing gentle in this account. Creation is an act of violence, and the world is quite literally built from the corpse of something older and larger than the gods themselves. Of those gods, 3 names have traveled furthest into our own time, though not always in the shape their worshippers would recognize. Begin with Odin. He is usually called the chief of the gods, and he is, though he is a strange sort of king. Picture an old man in a broad hat, pulled low, wrapped in a dark blue cloak, walking a road at dusk with a staff in his hand and one eye missing. He gave that eye away. He came to the well beneath the tree's root, where wisdom was kept, and the price of a single drink was an eye, and he paid it without argument. Later, seeking knowledge deeper still, he hanged himself from the branches of Yggdrasil for 9 nights, wounded with a spear, given no bread and no drink, sacrificed to himself, and in the 9th night the runes rose up to meet him, and he seized them, screaming, and fell. That story is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains what kind of god he was. Odin is not a protector. He is a seeker, restless and unsatisfied, willing to pay appalling prices for understanding. He is the god of poetry and of the runes, of magic and prophecy and disguise. 2 ravens named Thought and Memory fly out across the world each dawn and return at evening to whisper at his ear what they have seen. Wolves lie at his feet. He rides an 8-legged horse. He is also, and this troubled some of those who honored him, unreliable. Odin gathers the finest warriors to himself in death, and to do that, warriors must die. The old stories say quite openly that he grants victory and then withdraws it, that the men he favors most are the ones he takes soonest, because he wants them at his side for the last battle at the end of the world. To worship Odin was to accept a bargain with something that did not love you in any simple way. Kings and poets and warlords were drawn to him. Farmers, on the whole, were not. Farmers had Thor. If Odin is dusk and ambiguity, Thor is daylight and thunder. Red-bearded, enormous, hot-tempered, plain-spoken, he drives a chariot pulled by 2 goats across the sky, and the rumble of storms is the sound of his wheels. In his hand is the hammer Mjolnir, made by dwarves, which never misses and always returns. He eats vastly, drinks vastly, and solves most problems by hitting them. When a giant steals his hammer and demands the goddess Freyja in exchange, Thor is persuaded to dress as a bride and go to the wedding himself, veiled, seething, eating an entire ox at the feast, while his companion invents increasingly desperate explanations for the bride's appetite. It is a comedy, and it was clearly enjoyed as one. Yet Thor was the most widely loved of all the gods, and the evidence for that is everywhere. His name appears in place names across Scandinavia more often than any other. Small hammer amulets in silver, iron, and amber have been found in graves and settlements in their hundreds, worn around the neck, exactly as a cross was worn further south. He was the defender, the one who stood between the ordered world of farms and families and the chaos beyond the fence. When you are a smallholder in a hard climate, an unpredictable god of poetry and death is an object of awe. A strong friend who guards the boundary is something you actually want. Then there is Freyja, and with her, a whole second family of gods. Norse tradition remembers two divine kindreds, the Æsir and the Vanir, who fought a war long ago and settled it with an exchange of hostages. The Vanir are older, tied to fertility, prosperity, the growth of crops and the increase of herds. Freyja came to Asgard in that exchange, along with her brother Freyr and their father Njord, the god of the sea and safe harbors and profitable voyages. Freyja is the most complicated figure in the whole pantheon, and the most consistently misrepresented. She is indeed a goddess of love and desire, but she is also a goddess of war and of the dead, and the sources state plainly that half of those who fall in battle go to her, and only the other half to Odin. She rides a chariot drawn by cats, owns a falcon cloak that lets her fly, weeps tears of red gold for a lost husband, and possesses a famous necklace obtained at a price the later Christian writers clearly found scandalous. Above all, she is the mistress of a form of magic called Seda, a trance craft of prophecy and influence, which she is said to have taught to Odin himself. Her brother Freyr was worshipped with equal seriousness, particularly in Sweden, where the great temple at Uppsala reportedly held his image alongside those of Odin and Thor. He governed sunshine and rain and the fruitfulness of the earth, owned a ship that could be folded into a pouch, and gave away his sword for love, which is the reason he will fight the last battle unarmed. And then, moving among all of them, there is Loki. He is not a god of evil, whatever later retellings suggest, and he is not the northern devil. He is a giant by parentage, who lives among the gods, sworn brother to Odin, clever, charming, entirely without loyalty. Trouble follows him, and so does the solution to trouble, because in story after story, it is Loki who causes the disaster, and Loki who then talks or tricks his way out of it. He is the one who gets the gods their greatest treasures by wagering his own head, and the one who arranges the death of the gentlest god among them. He also changes shape without concern for what shape he takes, becoming a salmon, a fly, a mare, giving birth in that last form to Odin's eight-legged horse. His children are the wolf that will devour the sun, the serpent that circles the world, and the ruler of the dead. Loki matters because he embodies something the Norse understood very well. The same qualities that make a society strong, cleverness, boldness, the willingness to break a rule, are the qualities that can destroy it. He is not an outsider who invades. He is inside the hall, laughing, drinking with everyone else, and everyone knows what he is. Above the world of gods and giants hangs the question that every religion must answer: what happens when we die? The best-known answer is Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, and it deserves to be described properly, rather than in the shorthand that popular culture has left us. Picture a hall so enormous that the eye cannot find its far end, roofed with golden shields, rafters made of spear shafts, with 540 doors so wide that 800 warriors could march out of each of them shoulder to shoulder. A wolf hangs before the western door. An eagle circles above. Inside, the chosen dead feast each night on the meat of a boar that is killed and eaten and made whole again by morning, and drink mead that never runs dry, served to them by the Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, who ride over battlefields and decide who lives and who is taken. Each day the warriors go out and fight one another, and each evening the dead among them rise, and the wounds close, and they return to the hall together. It sounds like a reward, and it was understood as one. Yet notice what it is actually for. This is not paradise. This is a garrison. Odin is assembling an army, training it daily, feeding it well, and holding it in readiness for a single morning that is coming and cannot be prevented. Which brings us to fate, and to the idea that sits underneath everything else in this worldview. Beneath the great tree, at the well of destiny, sit three women. They are called the Norns, and they shape what will be. Not even the gods can overrule them. Odin, for all his sacrifices and all his stolen wisdom, has learned only one thing with complete certainty, which is how and when he will die. He cannot change it. He can only decide how to meet it. This is the heart of the matter. In this understanding of existence, the end of a life is already fixed, and so is the end of the world, and nothing anyone does will alter either. What remains within a person's control is conduct, how you behaved, whether you kept your word. Whether you stood your ground when standing was pointless. The old poem known as the Sayings of the High One puts it with a directness that still lands after 1,000 years, observing that cattle die and kinsmen die, and one day you will die too, but reputation never dies for the man who earns a good one. There is something bleak in that, and also something oddly consoling, and it explains a great deal about the behavior we are going to see over the next several hours. If your death is already written, then fear of it becomes almost irrational. What matters is the manner of it, and the story that survives you. The end of everything has a name, Ragnarok, the fate of the gods. It begins with winter. 3 of them in succession, with no summer between, snow blowing from every quarter, the world locked in ice and hunger. Brothers kill brothers for food. Oaths mean nothing. Then the wolf that has pursued the sun since the beginning of time at last catches it and swallows it, and another swallows the moon, and the stars fall from the sky. The mountains shake. The great serpent that lies coiled around the world in the depths of the ocean rises up and comes ashore, and the sea floods the land. From the east a ship comes, built from the untrimmed nails of dead men, carrying the giants. Loki, long imprisoned, breaks free and sails with them. The rainbow bridge shatters under the weight of the riders crossing it. On the plain where the last battle is fought, Odin faces the wolf and is swallowed. Thor kills the world serpent and walks 9 paces from its body before the venom takes him and he falls. Freyja, weaponless, goes down before a giant with a flaming sword. The fire spreads. The earth sinks into the sea. The end is total. And yet, it is not quite the end. After the water settles, the poems say, the earth rises again, green, and the fields grow grain unsown, and a few of the younger gods return, and find the old golden gaming pieces lying in the grass. 2 human beings, hidden in a wood, come out and repopulate the world. Whether that final consolation belongs to the original pagan tradition or was shaped by the Christian scholars who wrote the poems down, historians genuinely disagree, and it would be dishonest to tell you otherwise. What can be said is that the surviving version contains both an absolute ending and a renewal, held together without apparent difficulty. How did those beliefs express themselves in practice? Chiefly through ritual and through the treatment of the dead. Funerals in the Norse world varied enormously by region and by period, which is exactly what you would expect from a religion with no central authority. Some communities cremated their dead on great pyres, believing that fire carried the spirit upward. Others buried them intact. Some raised mounds. Some laid out stones in the outline of a ship around the grave. Some marked nothing at all. Grave goods followed the same pattern of variety, though the underlying logic is usually visible. People were sent onward with what their status and their work required. Tools for a craftsman, spindle whorls and keys for a woman who ran a household, weapons for a warrior, sometimes a horse, sometimes a dog, sometimes a fully loaded chest of provisions. The most magnificent example we possess was found in a farm field in Norway in 1904. The Oseberg ship is a vessel of oak more than 20 meters long, its prow curling into a carved spiral of interlacing beasts, so fine that it seems impossible it was cut with iron tools. It was buried in blue clay, which preserved it, and inside it lay two women. One was in her 70s or 80s, the other perhaps in her 50s. With them were sledges, a wooden cart, beds, tapestries, buckets, looms, the remains of at least 14 horses, and a great deal more. Nobody knows for certain who they were. A queen and her servant, perhaps. A priestess of Freyja. Two women of extraordinary standing whose names are simply lost. What is beyond doubt is that a community poured immense wealth into the ground to honor them, and that women in this society could be buried with the same splendor as any king. We also have a description of a Norse funeral written by an outsider who was there. In the early 10th century, an Arab diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan traveled up the Volga and encountered a group of northern traders. He watched them bury a chieftain in his ship and recorded it in detail, including a slave girl who agreed to die with her master and was killed and burned alongside him. His account is precious, and it is also a foreign observer's report of an unfamiliar rite, filtered through his own considerable distaste, and archaeologists still argue about how far it can be generalized. Human sacrifice certainly occurred in the Norse world. It was not an everyday occurrence. Animal sacrifice, on the other hand, was routine and central. The word for it was blot. At the great seasonal feasts, at midwinter especially, livestock were killed. The blood was sprinkled on the walls of the hall and on those present, and the meat was cooked and eaten in a shared meal, while toasts were drunk to the gods for a good year and peace. It was less an act of terror than an act of hospitality, a dinner to which the divine were invited. The German cleric Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, described a temple at Uppsala in Sweden, roofed in gold, holding statues of Thor, Odin, and Freyr, where every 9th year, 9 males of every kind, including men, were hanged in a sacred grove. He never visited. He was writing about pagans he wished to see converted, at second hand, and archaeology at Uppsala has found a great hall and burial mounds, but nothing that confirms his golden temple. Historians therefore treat him with caution. Something significant happened at Uppsala. Whether it happened as he described it is another question entirely. Set the gods aside for a while now, and come down to the level of the ground, to the smell of turf and animals and wood smoke, because the overwhelming majority of these people were not warriors or explorers at all. They were farmers, and their lives turned on rain and hay and the health of a cow. Norse society was arranged in layers, and the old poem called the Lay of Rig describes them in a way that is unflattering, memorable, and probably reasonably accurate about how the layers saw one another. At the bottom were the thralls, the enslaved. In the middle were the carls, free farmers and craftsmen. Above them stood the jarls, the aristocracy. Somewhere above the jarls, in theory, was a king. Kingship in the north began as a modest thing. An early king was a successful chieftain with a larger following, a better hall, and a claim to descent from the gods, usually from Freyja or Odin. He did not govern in any administrative sense. There were no tax officials, no written law, no standing army, no capital city. What he had was a warband, a reputation for generosity, and enough sworn men to make refusing him unwise. His authority extended roughly as far as he could sail in a summer, and it lasted roughly as long as his luck. Below him, the jarls were the men who mattered locally. A jarl held broad estates, commanded ships, hosted feasts, arbitrated disputes, and led men into battle. In many districts, the jarl was in practice more powerful than any distant king, and much of the political history of the Viking Age is the slow, violent process by which kings brought jarls to heel. The carls, though, were the backbone. A free farmer owned his land or rented it, worked it with his household, carried weapons, spoke at the assembly, and answered to nobody in his own doorway. That last point mattered enormously to them. A free man's home was legally protected space, and the difference between a carl and a thrall was not merely comfort but standing, the right to speak, to swear an oath, to seek compensation for injury, to be somebody rather than something. Below the carls stood the thralls, and here we reach a part of this history that popular retellings tend to slide past. Slavery was fundamental to the Viking world. Thralls worked the fields, ground the grain, dug the peat, herded the animals, and did the labor that made everything else possible. They could be bought and sold, given as gifts, and killed by their owners without serious legal consequence, though killing a slave did require compensating the owner, which tells you precisely how the law regarded them. Some were born into slavery. Many more were taken in raids, which is one of the central and least comfortable facts about Viking expansion. Ireland, Britain, the Baltic coast, and the Slavic lands all supplied captives, and the trade in human beings ran from northern Europe down to the markets of the Islamic world, where northern slaves fetched high prices. A thrall could sometimes be freed, either by an owner's grant or by purchase, and a freedman entered a shadowy intermediate status with limited rights that improved over generations. None of that softens the underlying reality. When we look at the silver in the hoards and the fine houses in the trading towns, a great deal of that wealth was generated by people who had been stolen from their homes. Now step inside a farm. The characteristic building of the Norse world is the longhouse, and its shape is remarkably consistent from Denmark to Greenland. Picture a single long rectangular structure, perhaps 5 to 7 meters wide, and anywhere from 15 to 50 meters long, with curved walls that bow outwards slightly at the middle, so that the whole building resembles an upturned boat. The frame is timber, resting on 2 rows of internal posts that carry the roof. In wooded Norway and Sweden, the walls might be planks or staves. In Denmark, wattle and daub packed between uprights. In treeless Iceland and Greenland, thick turf, cut in blocks and stacked in herringbone courses, walls sometimes 2 meters deep, so that the house looks less built than grown out of the hillside. There is a doorway at the side, low enough that you duck. Inside, it takes a moment for your eyes to adjust, because the windows are few and small and covered with stretched membrane rather than glass. Down the center of the floor runs a long hearth of stone, and the fire is never allowed to go out entirely. Smoke rises and gathers under the roof, drifting out through a hole above, which means that the upper air is thick and blue, and the lower air is breathable, and that everything and everyone in the house smells permanently of wood smoke. Along both long walls run raised earthen platforms, and these are the furniture of the house. People sit on them by day and sleep on them by night, on straw and furs and woolen blankets. The high seat, between 2 carved pillars, belongs to the head of the household and marks the social center of the building. At one end, often behind a partition, the buyer houses the cattle through the winter, their body heat contributing to the warmth of the whole structure, their presence contributing to the smell of it. The sounds of such a house at night are worth imagining. The settling of the fire, cattle shifting and breathing in the dark beyond the partition, wind pressing against turf and timber, somebody coughing, somebody working leather by firelight because the evening is long and there is nothing else to do, a child asleep against a dog. Food came almost entirely from the farm and from the water. Barley was the great northern grain, hardy enough to ripen in a short season, made into flatbread baked on a griddle, into porridge, and above all into ale, which everybody drank, including children, because it was safer than standing water, and because it carried calories. Rye and oats appeared in some regions. Wheat was a luxury. Dairying was central. Cows and sheep and goats gave milk that was turned into butter, cheese, and a thick soured product very like the skyer still eaten in Iceland today, which stored through the winter and provided protein when nothing was growing. Meat came from pigs, sheep, cattle, and horses, and eating horseflesh was so strongly associated with pagan feasting that the church later banned it, and Iceland only agreed to accept Christianity on the condition that the practice could continue quietly for a while. Fish were everywhere and in everything. Cod and herring from the sea, salmon and trout from the rivers, dried on wooden racks in the wind until they were hard as board and would keep for years. Stockfish of that kind became one of the great trade goods of the north. Seals, whales, and seabirds were taken where they could be got. Along the shore, mussels and seaweed filled gaps in a hungry spring. To that, add what the land offered without cultivation: wild berries in late summer, bilberries and lingonberries and cloudberries in the marshes, hazelnuts, onions, cabbage, peas and beans from small kitchen plots, herbs for flavor and for medicine. Honey, prized above everything for sweetness and for the making of mead, which was the drink of feasts and poetry rather than of ordinary evenings. Meals were taken twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, eaten from wooden bowls with a spoon and a personal knife that every adult carried at the belt. There were no forks. There was a great deal of soup and stew, simmered in an iron cauldron hanging over the fire, and a great deal of the same thing on consecutive days. The rhythm of the year governed everything. Spring meant lambing and calving and the sowing of barley, and often it meant hunger too, when last year's stores had run low, and this year's harvest was months away. Summer meant hay, endless hay, cut and dried and carried in, because the number of animals that could be kept alive through the winter depended entirely on how much fodder the household had gathered. Autumn meant harvest, then slaughter, choosing which beasts would not be fed until spring, salting and smoking and drying the meat. And then winter closed the door. Winter, though, was not idleness. It was the season in which everything else got made. By firelight and lamplight, through months when the sun barely cleared the hills, households produced the objects their lives depended on. Rope was twisted from lime bast and walrus hide. Barrels and buckets were coppered. Antler was sawn and riveted into combs, and everybody owned a comb, which is one of the small archaeological facts that quietly demolishes the myth of the filthy Viking. Combs turn up in graves and settlements in enormous numbers, along with tweezers, ear scoops, and razors. An English cleric writing in the 11th century complained that Danish settlers were seducing local women by combing their hair daily, bathing on Saturdays, and changing their clothes frequently, habits he clearly regarded as suspiciously fastidious. Above all, there was wool. It is difficult to overstate how much labor went into textiles, or how completely that labor fell to women. Every sail, every cloak, every tunic, every blanket, every sack began with fleece that had to be plucked or shorn, sorted, combed, spun into thread on a hand spindle, and woven on an upright loom, weighted with fired clay rings. Estimates suggest that a single large sail for an ocean-going ship could take several years of work by a group of women, consuming the wool of hundreds of sheep. Without that unglamorous, patient, endless production of cloth, no Viking ship ever left harbor. The voyages of exploration we will come to later were carried across the Atlantic on fabric made by hand in dark rooms. The position of women in Norse society is a subject where careful language matters, because the popular picture has swung from one extreme to the other. This was a patriarchal world. Men held political authority, spoke at assemblies, inherited primarily, and made the major decisions of the household in law. Yet compared with much of contemporary Christian Europe, women held real and defensible rights, and the sources are consistent about it. A married woman ran the household and carried the keys to its stores at her belt, and those keys were a genuine symbol of authority, not decoration. She could own property in her own name. She could inherit, particularly if there were no sons. She could divorce her husband, and the grounds were surprisingly broad, including violence, poverty, humiliation, or his failure to keep the marriage functional, and she took her dowry with her when she went. When men were away raiding or trading for a whole season, sometimes for years, it was women who managed farms, negotiated with neighbors, and held everything together. Marriage itself was an alliance between families, rather than a romance between individuals, negotiated with attention to land, standing, and the transfer of wealth in both directions. The bride brought a dowry. The groom's family paid a bride price and settled a mourning gift on her after the wedding, which remained hers. Both arrangements existed to protect her economically if the marriage ended, which suggests a legal culture that expected marriages to end sometimes and planned accordingly. As for the shield maiden, the woman who fought, this is where honest uncertainty belongs. Norse literature is full of them, and literature written centuries later is not evidence of practice. For a long time, historians treated them as pure legend. Then, in 2017, a study of a well-furnished warrior grave at Birka in Sweden, long assumed to be male because it contained weapons, horses, and gaming pieces, established through genetic analysis that the individual buried there was biologically female. The finding provoked a fierce and ongoing debate. Some scholars argue it demonstrates that women could hold warrior status. Others point out that grave goods reflect symbolic identity as well as occupation, and that one burial cannot settle a general question. The sensible position today is that we know one high-status woman was buried as a warrior, and that we do not know how common that was. Children grew up quickly. There was no extended adolescence and no schooling in any formal sense. A child learned by working alongside adults, and by about the age of 12 was expected to do an adult's share. Boys learned to handle a boat, an axe, an animal, and a weapon. Girls learned the whole textile process, dairying, cooking, and management. Infant mortality was high, and a newborn was not fully a member of the family until it had been formally acknowledged by the father, sprinkled with water in an old pre-Christian rite, and given a name. Names were serious. A child frequently received the name of a recently dead relative, in the belief that something of that person's luck returned with it. For entertainment, there were board games, and the pieces turn up constantly in graves. The favorite was Hnefatafl, an asymmetric game in which a king and his defenders try to escape from a larger attacking force, which is either a coincidence or a very neat reflection of the society that played it. There was wrestling, swimming, skating on bone skates, skiing, horse fighting, and a good deal of drinking. And there was poetry, which the Norse regarded as the highest of the arts, composed in intricate meters, dense with riddling metaphors, so that a ship becomes the horse of the waves, the sea becomes the whale road, blood becomes the sweat of the sword. A skilled poet could be rewarded with gold, or with his life, and at least one saga has a man save himself from execution by composing a praise poem for the enemy king overnight. Now, how did such a society keep order without police, prisons, or a state? The answer is the thing. At regular intervals, free men gathered in the open air at a recognized place, often a level field or a natural amphitheater marked with stones, to settle disputes, agree on law, hear cases, and make collective decisions. This assembly was called a thing, and versions of it existed across the entire Norse world, from local district gatherings up to the great regional assemblies of Iceland and Norway. The word survives in modern Scandinavian parliaments today. There were no professional judges. Cases were argued in front of the assembled community, with witnesses and oaths and procedural rules that were extremely strict, and a case could be lost on a technicality, just as it can now. In Iceland, which had no king at all, A man called the law speaker was elected to memorize the entire body of law and recite 1/3 of it aloud each year from the law rock, so that the whole legal system was carried in a single trained memory before it was ever written down. Punishment was rarely imprisonment, which would have required feeding a prisoner to no purpose. Instead, the system ran on compensation. Nearly every injury had a price. Kill a man and his family were entitled to a payment, the wergild, calculated according to his standing, and paying it settled the matter and closed the feud. Refuse to pay, or commit an offense too grave for payment, and the assembly could declare a man an outlaw. Outlawry was the most feared sentence in the North, and it deserves a moment's thought, because it was more terrible than it sounds. A lesser outlaw was banished for 3 years. A full outlaw lost every protection the law gave. He could be killed by anyone without consequence. Nobody was permitted to feed him, shelter him, or help him leave the country. In a landscape of that severity, exclusion from human society was, quite often, a slow death sentence, and the sagas are full of outlaws surviving in caves and on mountainsides, in a state that hovers between heroism and horror. Feud sat alongside the law rather than outside it. A killing created an obligation on the dead man's kin either to accept compensation or to take revenge, and honor frequently made the second option difficult to refuse. Whole sagas turn on families destroying one another over a slight that could have been settled with silver. The assembly existed precisely to interrupt that cycle, and it often succeeded, and sometimes it did not. None of this was gentle. It was, however, genuinely law, argued in public before free men, in an age when much of Europe was governed by whoever held the nearest castle. Everything we have described so far, the farms, the feuds, the assemblies, the hunger for silver, could have stayed within Scandinavia for another 1,000 years. One invention carried it outward. Walk down to a boat shed on a Norwegian shore in the 8th century and watch how a ship is made, because the method explains the result. There is no plan on paper, there is no paper. The shipwright works by eye and by memory, and by a set of proportions carried in his head and his hands, and he begins with a single piece of timber, the keel, cut from one long oak, with straight-grained and sound, sometimes 20 meters of it, which means finding and felling a tree that took 2 centuries to grow. To that keel are joined the stem and stern posts, curving upward at both ends, and already the profile of the finished vessel exists in outline, like a drawn bow. Now come the planks, and here is where the northern method diverged from the Mediterranean world. Instead of building a rigid skeleton and then covering it, the shipwright builds the shell first. Planks are added one at a time, each overlapping the one below, like the slats of a fence or the tiles of a roof, and fastened along that overlap with iron rivets hammered through and clenched over small square plates on the inside. This is clinker building, and it produces a hull that is not rigid at all. It flexes. Only after the shell is complete are the internal ribs inserted and lashed or fastened to it, and even then, the connection is often deliberately flexible. The planks themselves are not sawn. They are split. An oak trunk is riven radially with wedges, following the natural grain outward from the center, like the segments of an orange, and the resulting boards are far stronger than sawn timber, and far more resistant to splitting and to water. A single large ship might consume the timber of a dozen mature oaks, and represent tens of thousands of hours of skilled work, and rivets by the thousand, each one made by hand. The result is a vessel of astonishing character. Because the hull flexes, it rides over waves that would strain a stiffer ship to breaking. Because the planking is thin, sometimes only 2 or 3 centimeters, it is extraordinarily light for its size. Because there is no deep keel below, and the draft is shallow, sometimes less than a meter even on a large warship, it can cross a sandbar, run up a beach, or push 100 miles up a river that no seagoing vessel had any business entering. That last quality changed European history. A ship that can be beached needs no harbor. Men can be ashore in seconds and afloat again before a response arrives. A ship that can navigate rivers can reach an inland town that has never once considered itself coastal. Every assumption that Christian Europe had made about where the sea ended became worthless in about a generation. Then there is the sail. Scandinavians had been rowing boats for many centuries before they adopted sail, and the reasons for the delay are debated. Rowed vessels such as the Nidum boat from around the 4th century are recognizably ancestral in shape but carry no mast. Somewhere in the 7th or 8th century, sails appear in the north, and the effect is transformative. A single square sail of heavy wool, greased with animal fat to shed water and reinforced with a diamond pattern of rope, allowed a ship to cross open ocean without exhausting its crew. Rowing remained essential for rivers, for calms, for battle, and for the final approach. For the long haul, the wind did the work. Different tasks produced different ships, and it is worth separating them because popular imagination has collapsed them all into one. The warship, the true longship, was long, narrow, and fast, built for speed and for carrying men. The largest classes, sometimes called skeeds, could exceed 30 meters and carry crews of 60, 80 or more, sitting on their own sea chests to row, with their shields hung along the gunwale when at rest. Smaller vessels, the Snekja and the Karvi, served as the everyday transport of chieftains and small raiding parties. The cargo ship, the Knar, was an entirely different animal, broader, deeper, higher-sided, with a large open hold amidships and only a few oar positions at bow and stern. It relied almost wholly on sail. It was slower and far less elegant, and it could carry cattle, timber, grain, silver, and families. Every settlement in Iceland, Greenland, and the lands beyond was founded from the deck of a Knar. When you picture the Vikings crossing the North Atlantic, picture this fat, patient, tough little merchantman, not the dragon-proud raider. We know all of this in such detail for two reasons. First, because the Norse buried ships. The Oseberg and Gokstad vessels, recovered from Norwegian burial mounds, survive nearly complete. The Gokstad ship in particular is a superb ocean-going craft, and a full-scale replica of it crossed the Atlantic from Norway to Newfoundland in 1893 in 28 days, reaching speeds its builders would have envied. Second, because of a blockade. At Skuldelev in Roskilde Fjord in Denmark, 5 ships were deliberately sunk in the 11th century to close a channel against attack. Raised in the 1960s, they turned out to include a small warship, a great longship built in Dublin, a coastal trader, a fishing boat, and a deep-sea Knar. Between them they gave archaeologists an entire cross-section of Norse shipping, and the reconstructions built since have been sailed thousands of miles in open water by modern crews who learned, in the process, exactly how these vessels behave. Which raises the question that fascinates everyone. Without a compass, without charts, without instruments of any kind, how did they find their way? Partly by not going far from land. Most voyages hugged coastlines, moving from headland to headland, and the sailing directions preserved in later Icelandic texts are essentially descriptions of what you should see and when. Mountains, islands, the shape of a bay, the color of a cliff. For open ocean, they used latitude sailing. If you know the height of the midday sun, or of the pole star at night, you can hold a rough east or west line across an ocean. Sail north or south along a familiar coast until the sun sits at the correct height for your destination, then turn and hold that height as you cross. The medieval sailing directions for Greenland do exactly this, instructing a captain to sail west from a particular point in Norway, keeping far enough north to pass Shetland, just at the edge of visibility in clear weather. Beyond that lay a mass of practical knowledge that is easy to romanticize, and was probably rather mundane to those using it. Wave patterns and swell direction, which stay consistent for days and give a reliable heading. The color and temperature of the water. The flight of seabirds, which return to land in the evening. Driftwood, weed, the smell of the shore. The particular flat cloud that forms over an island, long before the island itself appears above the horizon. Whales and their known feeding grounds. The behavior of ravens carried aboard and released, following them if they flew purposefully, since a bird that finds no land comes back to the ship. Two more aids are much discussed and much less certain. A fragment of wooden disc found in Greenland has been interpreted as part of a sun compass, a dial that would allow the shadow of a central pin to be checked against a scratched curve to hold a course. The interpretation is plausible and disputed. The sunstone is more contested still. Later Icelandic sources mention a stone that revealed the sun's position in cloud, and calcite crystals do polarize light in a way that can locate the sun when it is hidden. No such stone has ever been found in a Norse context in a way that settles the argument. It may be true. It is not proven, and any documentary that presents it as established fact is going further than the evidence allows. What is certain is that life aboard was hard beyond easy imagining. There were no cabins. There was no cover, apart from a tent rigged at anchor, and perhaps a hide sheet over the cargo. Men slept where they sat or lay in the bottom of the boat in leather sleeping bags, wet, in a hull that took water constantly and had to be bailed at all hours. Food was dried fish, hard bread, salted meat and sour milk, eaten cold because a fire aboard was an unacceptable risk. Fresh water was carried in barrels and went foul. And still they went, out past the last islands and into an ocean that no one had mapped, on a wooden shell the thickness of your hand. Now come south with me, across the North Sea, to a low island off the coast of Northumbria, in the summer of the year 793. Lindisfarne is barely an island at all. Twice a day the tide withdraws, and a sand causeway emerges, joining it to the mainland, and twice a day the sea returns and takes the causeway back. Seals lie on the sandbanks. Wading birds work the mudflats. On the island stands a monastery founded 160 years earlier by Irish monks from Iona, and by this date it is among the most revered places in the Christian North, the house where St. Cuthbert lived and died, and where his body lies, drawing pilgrims from across Britain. It is also, in a sense that nobody there has considered, a bank. Monasteries of this period accumulated wealth continuously and defended it not at all. Kings and nobles gave land, gold, silver, jeweled reliquaries and altar plate in exchange for prayers for their souls. Manuscripts were bound in covers set with gems. Chalices were of precious metal. All of it sat on an undefended coast, guarded by men sworn to peace, protected by nothing except the certainty that no Christian would dare touch it. On the 8th of June, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, ships appeared offshore. What followed was over quickly. The raiders came ashore, killed some of the monks, drowned others in the sea, drove away a number as slaves, stripped the church of everything portable, and were gone before any force could reach the coast. In the scale of medieval violence, it was a small event. Its impact was out of all proportion to its size. The Chronicle records it with an air of genuine bewilderment, noting dreadful portents in Northumbria that year, whirlwinds and lightning and fiery dragons seen flying in the air, followed by famine, and then the harrying of the church at Lindisfarne by heathen men. The most vivid response came from Alcuin of York, an English scholar then serving at the court of Charlemagne, who wrote in shock that never before had such a terror appeared in Britain, and that no one imagined such an inroad from the sea was possible. The church of St. Cuthbert, he wrote, was spattered with the blood of the priests of God and stripped of its ornaments. Alcuin's letters are the best window we have into the psychological effect. He assumed, as any churchman of his age would, that the disaster was a punishment from God for the sins of the Northumbrians, and much of his correspondence urges reform of behavior and dress and morals so that it should not happen again. That interpretation is revealing precisely because it is wrong. It assumed a moral universe in which the attackers were an instrument rather than an interest group, with motives of their own. 2 points need to be made about Lindisfarne before we move on, and both cut against the way the story is usually told. First, it was not actually the beginning. 4 years earlier, at Portland in Dorset, 3 ships had arrived, and a royal official named Beaduherd rode down to meet them, apparently assuming they were traders, and instructed them to come to the king's estate. They killed him. That incident, recorded briefly, is the first known violent encounter, and the Reeves assumption tells us that ships from the north were already familiar enough on that coast to be unremarkable. The Salme ship burials in Estonia push the pattern of armed Scandinavian sea expeditions back further still. Lindisfarne is famous not because it was first, but because it was written about by people who mattered and because it struck at something sacred. Second, the raiders were not motivated by hatred of Christianity. Later writers, and a great deal of modern fiction, have imagined a religious war. There is little to support it. Monasteries were attacked because they were rich, undefended and accessible from the water, which is a straightforwardly practical set of reasons. Norse raiders attacked pagan Baltic communities and one another with the same enthusiasm. The evidence suggests men who were interested in silver, slaves and reputation, and were entirely unimpressed by the argument that a particular building should be exempt. So why then? Why does this begin in the last decade of the 8th century, rather than a century earlier or later? Historians have proposed several answers, and the honest position is that no single one is sufficient. The technological explanation points to the sail. Once Scandinavian ships could cross open water reliably, the entire coastline of Western Europe came within reach for the first time, and the opportunity was simply too obvious to ignore. There is real force in this, though the dating of sail adoption remains uncertain enough that it cannot carry the whole weight. The economic explanation looks at silver. During the 8th century, the flow of Arab silver into the Baltic through the eastern routes fluctuated, and the trading towns of the north had developed an appetite for bullion that domestic production could not meet. When one source faltered, another had to be found, and the churches of the West were conveniently placed. The political explanation looks at competition. As kings in Denmark and Norway began to consolidate power, they created losers, displaced chieftains, landless younger sons, ambitious men with followers to feed, and no inheritance coming. Raiding offered exactly what such men needed, which was wealth acquired quickly and reputation acquired publicly. The demographic explanation suggests population pressure on limited farmland, though the archaeological support for a sudden population surge is thin, and the argument is less fashionable than it once was. The provocation explanation is the most intriguing. Charlemagne spent the decades before Lindisfarne conducting a brutal campaign against the pagan Saxons on Denmark's southern border, involving forced conversion, mass deportations, and, on one occasion, the reported execution of thousands of prisoners in a single day. Danish rulers watched a Christian empire annihilating a neighboring pagan people and drawing closer every year. Some historians argue that the raids on Christian holy places were, in part, a response by men who understood exactly what was coming and chose to strike first at the source of their enemy's spiritual authority. The chronology fits. The evidence for intention does not survive. Most likely all of these forces braided together. What is clear is what happened next, which is that the experiment worked. Word travels fast in a maritime society. A ship returning to a Norwegian fjord with silver altar plate and captives, in one summer, with almost no losses, was an advertisement more persuasive than any argument. Within a year, raiders struck the monastery at Jarrow. In 795, they hit Iona itself, the mother house of Northumbrian Christianity, and Rathlin, off the Irish coast, and Iona would be attacked repeatedly until the monks finally carried their relics and their manuscripts inland to Kells for safety. Through the first decades of the 9th century, the pattern intensified. Small groups became larger fleets. Summer expeditions became longer campaigns. Raiders who had once come and gone began to overwinter, first on islands off the coasts of Ireland and England, then on the mainland, which changed everything, because an army that stays through the winter is no longer a raiding party. It is an occupation. Irish annals from this period read as a grim, repetitive litany of burned churches and stolen shrines, and yet even there, the picture complicates quickly. Within a generation, Norse leaders in Ireland were making alliances with Irish kings, marrying into local dynasties, and fighting other Norsemen on behalf of Irish patrons. The invaders became one more faction in a political landscape that already had many. The age of raiding had begun, and it would not stay an age of raiding for long. In the autumn of 865, something arrived on the coast of East Anglia that England had never seen before. Previous fleets had come for a season and gone home. This one did not. Contemporaries called it the Great Heathen Army, and it came with cavalry ambitions, siege intentions, and no return date. Its leadership was shared among several commanders, and here we meet, for the first time, names that have been carried by legend so far from their origins that separating the two takes patience. One name comes first, and it arrives trailing more story than any other in the north. Ragnar Lothbrok. Let the tale be told the way the North told it, because it is a beautiful thing in its own right, and because a story that survives for 400 years is a historical fact of a different kind. It begins with a girl in a tower and a serpent coiled at the foot of it, grown from a hatchling in a box until it circled the whole building and no man dared approach. A prince of Denmark heard of her and of the promise that whoever killed the creature could have her, and he went to a tanner and had a pair of woolen trousers boiled in pitch and rolled in sand, then walked out to meet the serpent in them and killed it, and the venom ran off the hardened cloth without touching him. He took the name from those trousers, and it clings to him still. Hairy breeches, shaggy trousers, Lothbrok. The stories that gather after that are the stories of a life lived at full stretch. A king who raided along the coasts of Francia and stood before Paris. A husband 3 times over, and the last of his wives, Aslaug, is said to have been the daughter of a hero and a shield maiden, and to have been wiser than any of the men around her, a father of sons who would outgrow him. An old man, in the end, unwilling to be outshone by his own children, who took 2 ships where he should have taken 20, and sailed for England to prove that he could still do alone what they did in fleets. He was wrecked on the Northumbrian coast, so the tale runs, and taken by King Aella and thrown into a pit of vipers. As the cold came into him, he is said to have laughed and spoken a verse about the little pigs who would grunt when they learned how the old boar had suffered. That is the legend, and it is magnificent, and almost none of it can be shown to have happened. Every detail of it comes to us from Icelandic and Danish literature written down 3 and 4 centuries later, in a tradition that wove history, folklore, and heroic poetry together without feeling any obligation to keep them apart. The 9th century sources that were actually written at the time do not mention him. They do mention a Viking leader in Francia, whose name appears in Latin as Regin Heri, who came up the Seine and attacked Paris in 845, took a payment of silver to leave, and died not long afterwards, apparently of illness rather than snakes. Whether that man is the seed of the legend, nobody can say. What is beyond doubt is that the men remembered as his sons were real. They existed, they commanded armies, and they appear in chronicles written by people who watched them arrive. That asymmetry, historical sons and a shadowy father, is the heart of the puzzle, and it points towards the likeliest explanation. Reputation in this world was inherited and displayed. A leader's authority rested partly on the fame of the family behind him, and where the fame was thin, the poets could always thicken it. Over generations, the deeds of several different chieftains may have been drawn together into one towering ancestor, because a single hero makes a cleaner story than 5 capable men whose careers overlapped untidily. Add a serpent, which the North loved, and a defiant death which the North loved even more, and the figure assembles himself. So the honest summary is this: Ragnar Lothbrok, as we meet him in the sagas, is a literary creation, built up over centuries. Somewhere beneath it, there may well be a real Danish warlord, or 2, or several. The snake pit almost certainly belongs to poetry rather than to Northumbria, and the idea that the great army came to England to avenge a murdered father is a later explanation, stitched onto an invasion that needed no such reason, since York and its treasuries were reason enough. None of that makes the legend worthless. It tells us precisely what these people admired: cleverness that solves an impossible problem with boiled trousers, courage that will not be diminished by age, and above all, a death met with a joke and a prophecy, which is the ending every man in that hall would have chosen for himself if he could. His reputed sons are on firmer ground. Ivar, called the Boneless, appears in Irish and English sources as a commander of exceptional ability and ruthlessness. The nickname has never been satisfactorily explained. Suggestions have included a disability that meant he was carried into battle on a shield, a metaphor for cunning or for a serpent-like quality, or something far cruder about impotence. Nobody knows. What the sources agree on is that he was feared, that he operated across both Ireland and England, and that he was the driving intelligence behind much of the campaign that followed. Halfdan, another brother, led armies in Northumbria and later divided conquered land among his followers, which is the moment raiding turns into settlement. Ubba appears in the campaigns in East Anglia and the southwest. Bjorn Ironside, most famous of all after Ivar, is credited with an extraordinary Mediterranean expedition, sailing through the Strait of Gibraltar with the leader Hastin, raiding Spain, North Africa and Italy, and reportedly attacking the Italian city of Luna in the belief that it was Rome. The Mediterranean voyage is attested in Frankish and Arab sources, and did happen, though the details grew colorful in the retelling, particularly the tale of the raiders gaining entry to Luna by feigning their leader's death and asking for Christian burial. Whatever the truth of its leadership, the Great Army's campaign in England was systematic and devastating. It wintered in East Anglia, taking horses in exchange for peace. In 866, it rode north and took York, the wealthiest city in the north of England, in a swift assault, while the Northumbrians were divided by civil war. When they attempted to retake it the following spring, they broke into the city, were trapped in the streets, and were slaughtered along with both of their rival kings. Mercia was next, then East Anglia again, where the young King Edmund was captured and killed in 869, becoming a martyr and eventually the patron saint of England for several centuries. Within 5 years, 3 of the 4 great English kingdoms had been destroyed. Only Wessex remained. The Wessex campaign of 871 was a brutal succession of battles, and in the middle of it, in April, the West Saxon king died, and his youngest brother inherited a war he was losing. He was 22 years old, and his name was Alfred. His story over the following 7 years came close to ending in complete failure. He bought peace, and it did not hold. He fought and was beaten. At midwinter in 878, the Danish leader Guthrum launched a surprise attack on Chippenham during the Christmas festival, and Alfred fled into the marshes of Somerset with a handful of men, hiding on an island at Athelney, while a foreign army occupied his kingdom. It is at this low point that the tale of the burnt cakes attaches itself to him, a story invented much later, in which a peasant woman scolds the disguised king for letting her baking spoil. Charming, and not history. What is history is what he did next. Through that spring he sent messengers out across the countryside, and in May the men of Somerset, Wiltshire and Hampshire gathered to him at a stone on the edge of Selwood Forest. They marched, and at Eddington they broke Guthrum's army in a shield wall fight, pursued the survivors back to Chippenham, and besieged them for a fortnight until they surrendered. The terms Alfred imposed are as significant as the victory. Guthrum agreed to leave Wessex and to accept baptism, with Alfred standing as his godfather, a piece of political theatre that converted an enemy into a kind of kinsman. The Danish leader took a Christian name and withdrew to East Anglia, where he ruled and minted coins with it. A treaty followed, and a boundary, running roughly along the old Roman road of Watling Street from London towards Chester. North and east of that line, Scandinavian law and custom held. South and west, English. The region beyond the line acquired a name that has stuck ever since: the Danelaw. What the Danelaw actually was is worth being careful about. It was not a single state. It was a patchwork of Scandinavian-ruled territories, including the Kingdom of York, the lands of the 5 boroughs at Lincoln, Nottingham, Derby, Stamford and Leicester, and Danish East Anglia. Its populations were mixed from the start, and the incomers settled as farmers as much as they ruled as lords. The evidence for settlement is all over the map of England to this day. Place names ending in "by", meaning a farmstead or village, appear in their hundreds across Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and the East Midlands. Grimsby, Whitby, Selby, Derby, names ending in Thorpe, an outlying farm, and Thwaite, a clearing, and Toft, a plot of land. A field boundary in Lincolnshire may still follow a division agreed by a Danish farmer in the 9th century. Alfred, meanwhile, spent his remaining years doing something more consequential than winning a battle. He built a network of fortified towns, the burhs, spaced so that nowhere in Wessex was more than a day's march from a stronghold, and he reorganized the militia so that half the men were in the field, while half remained on their farms, and he began building larger ships. He also gathered scholars, translated books he considered essential from Latin into English, and set about restoring learning in a kingdom where, as he complained himself, hardly anyone south of the Thames could still read the Latin of the church services. His son and grandsons finished what he had started, pushing north through the 10th century, absorbing the boroughs one by one. In 954, the last Scandinavian king of York, Eric Bloodaxe, was driven out and killed, and England existed as a single kingdom for the first time in its history. The irony is difficult to miss. The invasions that were meant to destroy the English kingdoms ended by unifying them. While that long struggle unfolded in England, similar stories were playing out along every coast within reach of a Norse keel, and each of them developed its own character. Ireland in the 9th century was not a kingdom but a mosaic of perhaps 150 small realms bound together by shifting overlordships, and its monasteries were as rich and as vulnerable as those of Northumbria. Raids began in 795 and grew steadily. Then, in 841, Norse crews built a fortified ship enclosure on the River Liffey, a long fort, and stayed. That settlement became Dublin. Dublin's rise is one of the great transformations of the age. Within a century it had grown from a raiding base into the most important trading city in the Irish Sea, exporting slaves, importing silver, minting coins, building ships, and connecting Ireland to Scandinavia, England, Francia, and beyond. Excavations at Wood Quay uncovered street after street of 10th century timber houses, wattle fences, workshops, leather shoes, wooden bowls and combs, preserved in wet ground in extraordinary condition. Waterford, Wexford, Cork and Limerick all began in the same way, and Ireland's first true towns were therefore founded by Scandinavians. Integration followed quickly. Norse and Irish intermarried, and their descendants, called the Gall Goidel, the foreign Gaels, formed a distinct group with a foot in both worlds. Dublin's rulers allied with Irish kings against other Irish kings, and against other Norsemen when it suited them. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014 has often been presented as the moment the Irish under Brian Boru expelled the Vikings, and it was nothing so simple. Norse and Irish forces fought on both sides. The causes were largely internal Irish politics, and Brian, by then an old man, was killed in the aftermath of a battle his side won. Scandinavian Dublin carried on as before. Scotland and the Northern Isles took a different path altogether, because there the settlement was so dense that it replaced what came before. Orkney and Shetland lie a short sail from Norway, and by the 9th century they had been thoroughly colonized. The old Pictish language disappeared entirely, and a Norse dialect called Norn was spoken there into the 18th century. The earldom of Orkney became a formidable power in its own right, controlling Caithness on the Scottish mainland and raiding widely. At Jarlshof in Shetland, layer upon layer of longhouses lie stacked over centuries of continuous occupation. The Hebrides and the western seaboard became a Norse Gaelic world, ruled eventually from the Isle of Man, where the assembly at Tynwald claims a continuous existence of more than 1,000 years, and remains the parliament of the island today. Man's carved stone crosses show the transitional moment beautifully, with Christian crucifixions on one face and scenes from Norse myth on the other. Odin being devoured by the wolf carved by a sculptor who had recently accepted baptism. Nobody appears to have found this contradictory. Further out, the Faroe Islands were settled in the 9th century, or perhaps earlier, since recent environmental evidence suggests sheep and barley may have arrived there before the Norse, possibly with Irish monks. 18 islands of green cliff and cloud in the middle of the North Atlantic, where a small population learned to live on sheep, seabirds and fish, and where the Faroese language, descended directly from Old Norse, is still spoken. Turn now to the continent, where the Vikings encountered something quite different, a large, wealthy, organized empire. Charlemagne's Frankish Empire had a coast guard, defended river mouths and a formidable army. Under him and his son Louis, raids were troublesome but contained. Then, from the 840s onwards, the empire tore itself apart in a succession of civil wars between his grandsons, and the coordinated defense collapsed. Fleets moved up the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, the Somme, and the Garonne, striking Rouen, Nantes, Bordeaux, Hamburg, Cologne, and repeatedly Paris. Frankish rulers responded with a policy that proved catastrophic in the long run. They paid. Danegeld, or its Frankish equivalent, bought a fleet's departure, and the sum grew larger each time. Rival Frankish princes hired Norse fleets against each other, granting land and silver in exchange for service. Every payment demonstrated that the strategy worked, and every payment funded the next fleet. The most famous of these campaigns began in November of 885, when a vast force came up the Seine and halted before Paris. Paris then was not the city we know. It was concentrated on an island in the river, the Ile de la Cité, walled, with 2 fortified bridges, linking it to the banks and blocking passage upstream. Whoever held those bridges controlled the whole Seine Valley. The Frankish sources give impossible numbers for the besieging fleet, hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men, and even discounted heavily, the force was enormous. Defending the city were Count Odo and Bishop Goslin, with a garrison that may have numbered only a few hundred. The siege lasted almost a year, and we have an unusually detailed account of it because a monk named Abbo of Saint-Germain-des-Prés was inside and wrote a long poem about what he saw. The attackers built siege towers and battering rams, filled the ditches, sent fire ships against the bridges. The defenders poured boiling oil, pitch and wax on the men below, and rebuilt the towers as fast as they were damaged. A flood swept away one bridge and isolated a small garrison in its tower, and the 12 men holding it refused to surrender and were killed to the last. Disease took the bishop. Odo rode out through the lines to beg for help from the emperor and fought his way back in. When the Emperor Charles the Fat finally arrived with a large army, he did not attack. He negotiated, paid several £100 of silver, and gave the Norse permission to sail upriver past Paris to ravage Burgundy, which was in revolt against him. To the defenders who had endured a year of siege, this was an unforgivable betrayal. Charles was deposed within 2 years. Odo was elected king in his place, and his family, the Capetians, would eventually rule France for centuries. Out of that chaos came the settlement with the longest consequences of all. In the year 911, King Charles the Simple made an agreement at Saint-Clair-sur-Epte with a Norse leader named Rollo, whose Norse name was probably Hrolfr. The Frankish king granted him land around the mouth of the Seine, including Rouen, in exchange for his loyalty, his baptism, and his commitment to defend the river against other Vikings. It was the old strategy of setting a wolf to guard the sheep, and this time it worked, at least in the short term. Rollo's territory expanded, and it acquired a name from the people who held it: the land of the Northmen, Normandy. What happened there over the next century and a half is a study in how quickly assimilation can proceed. Rollo's descendants adopted the French language so completely that within 3 generations, a duke had to send his son to Bayeux to learn any Norse at all. They adopted Frankish law, Frankish landholding, Frankish cavalry warfare, and Christianity, becoming among the most enthusiastic church builders in Europe. They kept the restless, expansionist energy of their ancestors and applied it in an entirely new idiom, conquering southern Italy and Sicily, fighting in Spain and eventually in the Crusades. And in 1066, a descendant of Rollo, in the 6th generation, would cross the Channel to claim the throne of England, in ships that were still, in their construction, unmistakably Scandinavian. Far to the north and west, meanwhile, a very different kind of expansion was underway, and it began, according to tradition, with a haircut. Harald Fairhair is remembered as the first king to rule all of Norway, and the story attached to him has him swearing an oath not to cut or comb his hair until he had achieved it, which took 10 years and left him with a nickname considerably less flattering than the one he ended with. The decisive battle at Hafrsfjord, near modern Stavanger, is traditionally dated to around 872, though the date is uncertain, and historians increasingly suspect that Harald's kingdom was smaller and less unified than the sagas claim, covering the western coastal districts rather than the whole country. The consequences, however, are not in doubt. Consolidation of royal power meant the subjection of independent chieftains, the imposition of taxes, and the loss of the old freedoms of the fjords. Some accepted it, others took their families, their livestock, their households and their ships, and left. Iceland had been found not long before, apparently by accident, by sailors blown off course on the run to the Faroes. When the settlers began arriving in earnest, around 870, they came to an island the size of Ireland that was, as far as anyone could tell, empty. Irish monks may have been there before them, seeking solitude, and left when neighbors arrived. Imagine what those first crews saw as the land rose out of the sea: black volcanic cliffs, glaciers glowing white above lava fields, steam drifting up out of the ground in valleys where hot springs bubbled, beaches of black sand, birch scrub covering perhaps a quarter of the island, and grass, and no other human being anywhere. The tradition names Ingolfur Arnarsson as the first permanent settler and describes him throwing the carved pillars of his high seat overboard as he approached, vowing to build where the sea chose to land them. They came ashore in a bay where steam rose from hot springs, and he called the place Smoky Bay, Reykjavik. Within 60 years, the available land was taken, and the settlement period closed with a population of perhaps a few tens of thousands. What they built there is genuinely remarkable, because they built a country with no king. In the year 930, the Icelanders established a national assembly at Thingvellir, a place chosen with an eye for both practicality and drama. A great rift valley runs through the landscape there, where the tectonic plates of Europe and America pull apart, leaving a wall of dark rock with a natural acoustic that carries a speaking voice across the plain. Every summer, free men rode from across the island to camp there for a fortnight, to hear the law recited from the rock, to bring cases before the courts, to arrange marriages, trade horses, settle feuds, and hear news. The Althing has claim to being the oldest continuously existing parliament in the world. Iceland also gave us the sagas, and without them our knowledge of this entire world would be a fraction of what it is. Written in the 13th and 14th centuries, in prose of striking economy and restraint, they tell the stories of the settlement families, their quarrels, their journeys, and their deaths. Their historical reliability is limited and variable, and they are the products of Christian authors writing about a pagan past, 200 or 300 years gone. They are also, considered purely as literature, some of the finest narrative prose produced anywhere in medieval Europe. Around the year 980, a man in Iceland was outlawed for 3 years for killing his neighbors in a dispute that had begun, in the usual way, with a smaller dispute. His name was Erik the Red, and he had already left Norway under similar circumstances. Rather than wait out the sentence, he decided to sail west and investigate a coastline that had been sighted by a storm-driven ship some decades earlier. He found a vast land of ice, rock, and fjords, and along the southwestern coast, sheltered inland, valleys with real grass. Erik spent 3 years exploring and returned to Iceland to recruit settlers, and he named the place Greenland, according to the sagas, because a favorable name would attract more people. This may be the earliest recorded example of a state agent's language, and it worked. In 986, a fleet of 25 ships set out. 14 arrived. The Greenland colony lasted about 4.5 centuries, and at its height, held perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 people in 2 main settlements, with churches, farms, sheep, cattle, and a bishop. Its economy depended on export, and its most valuable product was walrus ivory from hunting grounds far to the north, which supplied much of the ivory used by carvers in Europe before elephant ivory returned to the market. From Greenland, the coast of North America is not far. The saga accounts differ in detail, which is itself instructive, but the outline is consistent. A merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson, sailing to Greenland, was blown off course and sighted unknown wooded land to the west, but did not go ashore. Years later, Leif, son of Erik the Red, bought Bjarni's ship and went to look. He found 3 coasts, naming them for what he saw: a place of flat stones, a place of forests, and furthest south, a place he called Vinland, where the grass stayed green late, salmon ran large, and grapes or berries grew. For centuries this was regarded as a pleasant national myth. Then, in 1960, a Norwegian explorer and his archaeologist wife, Helga and Anne Steen Ingstad, following the sailing directions in the sagas and asking local people whether there were any old ruins nearby, were shown a set of overgrown mounds at the northern tip of Newfoundland. Excavation at Lonso's Meadows revealed 8 turf buildings of unmistakably Norse construction: a smithy with iron slag, a bronze cloak pin, a soapstone spindle wall, and boat rivets. The debate was over. Europeans reached the Americas around the year 1000, 5 centuries before Columbus. Recent analysis of wood from the site, using a spike in atmospheric radiation from a known solar event in the year 993 as a marker, has dated felled timber there to precisely 1021, the first exact date for a European presence in the Americas. What the site is not is a colony. It appears to have been a base camp, occupied briefly, probably for repairing ships and as a gateway to richer land further south. Butternuts found there do not grow in Newfoundland, which means someone traveled at least as far as the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Why did it fail? The sagas are unusually frank about the answer. The Norse encountered people already living there, whom they called skraelingar, a dismissive term. Initial contact involved trade, cloth and milk exchanged for furs. It turned violent, repeatedly. Faced with a large indigenous population, at the end of a supply line stretching back through Greenland to Iceland to Norway, with perhaps 100 people at the far end of it, the settlers made the only sensible calculation available and went home. The Greenland colony itself faded in the 15th century, and the reasons remain genuinely debated. Climate cooled as the medieval warm period gave way to colder centuries, shortening growing seasons and increasing sea ice. The ivory trade collapsed as African elephant ivory returned to European markets. Shipping contact with Norway dwindled after the Black Death devastated the homeland. Some scholars once argued that the Norse starved through cultural inflexibility, refusing to adopt Inuit techniques for hunting seals and whales. More recent isotope analysis of their bones shows they ate a great deal of marine food, so that explanation has weakened. Others now suspect a gradual, orderly abandonment, families leaving on ships over decades until nobody remained. The last written record of them is a wedding at Falsey Church in 1408, recorded in Iceland, because the couple later traveled there. After that, silence. When Europeans returned to Greenland's western coast, they found ruined churches, empty longhouses, and the ancestors of the Thule people who had outlasted them. Turn now in the opposite direction, because the story of the North is only half told if we look only west. While Norwegians and Danes sailed towards Britain, Ireland and Francia, Swedes were moving east across the Baltic, and what they found there was not a coast to raid, but a continent to trade across. The rivers of Eastern Europe run enormous distances, and if a man is willing to drag his boat overland between one river system and another, he can travel from the Baltic to the Black Sea or to the Caspian entirely by water. That is precisely what they did. 2 great routes emerged. One followed the Volga east and south, ending at the Caspian and connecting to the caravan roads of Central Asia and the markets of the Abbasid Caliphate at Baghdad. The other followed the Dnieper south to the Black Sea and on to Constantinople, and it was known as the route from the Varangians to the Greeks. Neither was easy. A journey down the Dnieper meant negotiating a series of cataracts, stretches of rock and white water, where the boats had to be unloaded and hauled or carried overland, sometimes for miles, while lookouts watched for the nomadic raiders who knew exactly where and when travelers would be at their most vulnerable. A Byzantine emperor, Constantine Porphyrogenitus, wrote a detailed description of these rapids in the 10th century, giving their names in both Slavic and Norse, and his account remains one of the best pieces of evidence we have for who was actually using the river. What flowed north along these routes was silver, and it came in staggering quantity. More than 200,000 Islamic silver coins, dirhams, have been recovered from Viking Age contexts in Scandinavia and the Baltic. Gotland, an island in the Baltic between Sweden and the eastern shore, has yielded more buried silver hoards than anywhere else in northern Europe, hundreds of them, containing coins minted in Baghdad, Samarkand, Tashkent, and beyond. A hoard found at Spillings on Gotland weighed some 67 kilograms. Understand how this silver was used, and you understand something important about the northern economy. It was not currency in our sense. Coins were valued by weight and purity, rather than by their face value or the authority that issued them, and they were routinely cut into fragments to make up an exact amount. Archaeologists call it hack silver, chopped coins, snipped arm rings, broken brooches, all mixed together in a purse with a small folding balance and a set of weights. A merchant in Hedeby weighed his payment. What was stamped on it did not matter. What flowed south to pay for that silver is the uncomfortable part. Furs, in enormous quantities. Marten, sable, fox, beaver, and squirrel from the northern forests, in demand across the Islamic world and Byzantium for the lining of robes. Honey and beeswax, the second essential for church candles. Amber, walrus ivory and narwhal tusk, the latter frequently sold as unicorn horn to buyers who paid extraordinarily well for it. Falcons, trained for hunting, prized by Arab nobility. Swords of Frankish manufacture, so valued that Frankish kings tried repeatedly and unsuccessfully to ban their export. Wax, wool, dried fish, iron, soapstone, whetstones, and slaves. Human beings formed one of the largest and most profitable elements of the Eastern trade, and there is no honest way to tell this story without saying so plainly. Captives taken in raids around the Baltic and in the Slavic lands were marched or shipped south in coffles and sold in the markets of Bulgar on the Volga, and onward to Baghdad and beyond. The traffic ran for 2 centuries and was one of the principal engines that pumped Islamic silver into northern Europe. When we look at the beautiful ornaments in the museum cases, at the fine filigree brooches and the ring money, we are also looking at the proceeds of a slave trade. Coming north with the silver came other things too, and they turn up in the most unexpected places. Silk has been found in graves at Birka and in the Oseberg burial, some of it from Byzantium, some apparently from further east. Glass beads from the Middle East, cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean. A small bronze Buddha figure from northern India, made in the 6th century, was excavated at Helgå in Sweden, along with an Egyptian ladle and an Irish crosier. Quite how a Buddha reached a Swedish island is unknown, and the object itself is a perfect emblem of how far these networks reached. At the far end of the southern route stood the greatest city in the Christian world, Constantinople, which the Norse called Miklagard, the Great City, was unlike anything in their experience. Where a large northern town might hold 1,000 people, this held several 100,000. Its triple land walls had never been breached. Its harbor bristled with masts. At its center stood the church of Hagia Sophia, its dome so vast and so lightly supported that it appeared to visitors to hang from heaven on a golden chain, filled with the smell of incense and the sound of chant, and lit by hundreds of lamps reflecting off gold mosaic. Imagine arriving there in a small open boat after months on rivers, having portaged past rapids, having slept on riverbanks in the rain, and looking up at that. Trade with Byzantium was carefully regulated, and the treaties survive. Rus merchants were required to enter the city by a specific gate, unarmed, in groups of no more than 50 at a time, accompanied by an imperial official, and to lodge in a designated quarter outside the walls near the monastery of Saint Mamaz. They were fed and supplied for their stay, and given provisions for the journey home. The Byzantines wanted the trade very much, and wanted armed northerners inside their capital not at all. And the arrangement expresses both attitudes precisely. Those treaties were not achieved through negotiation alone. Rus fleets attacked Constantinople several times, in 860 and again in the 10th century. coming down the Bosphorus in hundreds of small boats and burning the suburbs along the shore, before being driven off, on at least one occasion, by the terrifying Byzantine incendiary weapon known as Greek fire, a liquid that burned on water and could be sprayed from siphons mounted on ships. Each attack ended in a treaty. Each treaty improved the terms of trade. Violence and commerce were not opposites in this world. They were two settings on the same instrument. The flow of silver eventually faltered. In the late 10th century, the silver mines of Central Asia that had supplied the dirham trade began to fail, and the quality of the coins declined as they were debased. Hoards from the closing decades of the Viking Age contained fewer Eastern coins and more German and English ones, and the balance of the northern economy tilted back towards the west, just as the Danish kings were beginning to extract enormous tribute payments from England. Long before that, though, the men who traveled these rivers had done something none of them intended. They had left a permanent mark on the political geography of Eastern Europe, and given their name to a state that still exists. The name in question is Rus, and few words in early medieval history have been argued over with more energy. The traditional account comes from the Primary Chronicle, compiled in Kiev in the early 12th century by monks working with older material. It relates that the Slavic and Finnic peoples of the north drove out the Varangians, who had been taking tribute from them, then fell to quarreling among themselves so badly that they invited them back, saying that their land was great and rich, but had no order in it, and asking them to come and rule. 3 brothers came, and the eldest, Rurik, settled at Novgorod. His successors moved south to Kiev, and from that beginning grew the state we call the Kievan Rus. Historians treat this story with considerable caution. It was written more than 2 centuries after the events it describes, by clerics with an interest in providing a dynasty with a dignified origin, and the motif of a people inviting foreign rulers to impose order appears in other medieval foundation legends. Rurik himself may or may not have existed. What the chronicle preserves is likely to be a compressed and tidied memory of a much messier process. The archaeology is clearer. Scandinavian material appears in quantity at sites along the northern river routes from the 8th century onward. At Staraya Ladoga, near the mouth of the Volkhov, there is Norse settlement material from around 750. At Gnezdovo near Smolensk, on the upper Dnieper, there are thousands of burial mounds containing a mixture of Scandinavian, Slavic, and Baltic material. Norse names appear all over the early treaties with Byzantium: Ingvar, Helgi, Helga, Sveinald, rendered into Slavic forms as Igor, Oleg, Olga, Sviatoslav. Yet the same evidence shows how rapidly those incomers merged into the far larger population around them. By the 3rd generation, the ruling family bore Slavic names, spoke a Slavic language, and worshipped Slavic gods before adopting Christianity. Sviatoslav, grandson of the traditional founder, was a Slavic-named warlord of formidable ability. His son Vladimir accepted Byzantine Christianity in the year 988, and with that decision, the entire Eastern Slavic world turned towards Constantinople rather than Rome, a choice whose religious and cultural consequences are still visible today. The question of what exactly the word Rus meant has fueled a debate that became, for a long time, uncomfortably political. One school held that Scandinavians founded the Russian state. Another insisted the state was a purely Slavic achievement, and during certain periods of Russian and Soviet history, the second view was strongly encouraged, for reasons that had nothing to do with archaeology. The mainstream position now is more measured, and frankly, more interesting. Scandinavians were unquestionably present, unquestionably prominent among the early elite, and unquestionably not the sole authors of anything. What emerged along those rivers was a hybrid, a merchant and military class of mixed origin, operating among Slavic, Finnic, Baltic and steppe peoples, and the state it produced was the joint work of all of them. The likely origin of the word itself lies in an Old Norse term connected with rowing, which passed through Finnish to become the name others gave to these rivermen. From Kiev grew a realm that at its height stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea and stood as one of the largest polities in Europe, the common ancestor claimed by modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Novgorod became a great trading republic with its own assembly, and it is not a coincidence that its citizens governed themselves through a public gathering of free men in the northern manner. Out of all this came the most extraordinary employment opportunity of the age. Byzantine emperors had a problem that every ruler of a sophisticated state eventually faces. The men best placed to protect them were also the men best placed to overthrow them. Palace guards drawn from the empire's own aristocracy had families, factions, ambitions, and cousins in the Senate. What an emperor really wanted was a body of exceptional soldiers with no local connections whatsoever, who did not speak the language well, had no stake in court politics, and whose loyalty could be secured by paying them extremely well. In the year 988, the Emperor Basil II, fighting for his throne against a rebellion, received 6,000 warriors from Vladimir of Kiev as part of the agreement that brought Christianity to the Rus. He used them, they were devastatingly effective, and he kept them. That force became the Varangian Guard. For the next 2 centuries it served as the emperor's personal bodyguard, and as his shock troops, distinguished by the long 2-handed axes they carried over the right shoulder, which earned them the Byzantine nickname of the axe-bearing barbarians. Their appearance in the chronicles is invariably at moments of crisis, and their record for loyalty was remarkable. Byzantine writers noted that they were faithful to the office rather than the man, serving whoever legitimately held the throne, and this made them the most reliable institution in a court famous for conspiracy. Service in the Guard was highly sought after in Scandinavia. Runestones back home commemorate men who went to Greece, and one from Uppland records that a certain Ragnvald had been a commander in Greece. Others note inheritance disputes over the wealth of men who died there. A guardsman was paid in gold, given a share of imperial plunder, and permitted by custom to help himself from the palace treasury when an emperor died, an occasion known as the palace sweeping, which must have made imperial funerals unusually attentive events. The most famous Varangian of all arrived around 1034. He was a young Norwegian nobleman, half-brother to a king, who had fled the country after a lost battle at the age of 15, made his way to Kiev, served the prince there, and then continued south. His name was Harald Sigurdsson, and he would later be called Hardrada, the Hard Ruler. He spent roughly a decade in Byzantine service and rose to command. He fought in Asia Minor against Arab raiders, in Sicily under the general George Maniakis, in Bulgaria, and possibly in the Holy Land escorting pilgrims. The Byzantine and Norse accounts of his exploits diverge considerably, and the saga versions include several siege stratagems that appear in older Greek and Roman literature and have almost certainly been borrowed. What is not in doubt is that he acquired an enormous fortune, sent much of it back to Kiev for safekeeping, married the daughter of the prince there, and eventually left for home, carrying more wealth than any man in Scandinavia. His departure was not entirely amicable. He appears to have fallen foul of the Empress Zoe, spent time in prison, and escaped during a palace revolution, breaking through the Great Chain across the Golden Horn on his way out, according to a story that may be true and is certainly good. Consider the shape of that life for a moment. A boy from a Norwegian valley, wounded at 15 in a battle for his brother's kingdom, who fled east across the mountains, served a prince on the Dnieper, guarded an emperor in the greatest city on earth, fought under Mediterranean sun in Sicily and North Africa, and returned north with chests of gold to claim a throne beside the fjords. Nothing about the world we have been describing produces a life like that by accident. It required the ships, the rivers, the trade routes, the reputation of northern fighting men, and the peculiar politics of an empire that trusted foreigners more than its own. He would die at the far end of that world, in a field in Yorkshire, and his death is generally taken to mark the end of the age. Before we follow him there, we should look closely at how these men actually fought, because the picture in popular imagination is a curious mixture of the accurate and the entirely invented. Start with what a warrior carried, and start at the bottom of the scale, rather than the top. The spear was the most common weapon in the Norse world, and by a wide margin. It was cheap, requiring only a modest amount of iron and a length of ash. It was effective in formation. It could be thrown or held, and almost every free man owned one. It was also the weapon of Odin, whose spear Gungnir never missed, and there was a custom of casting a spear over an enemy army before battle to dedicate them to him. The axe came next in frequency, because every household already had one for splitting firewood, and the step from a wood-cutting axe to a fighting axe is a short one. Dedicated war axes evolved into something formidable, a thin, light head with a wide, sweeping cutting edge, mounted on a haft of up to 1.5 meters. The great two-handed Danish axe, which came into use towards the end of the period, could split a shield or cut down a horse, and its wielder had to fight without a shield of his own, which tells you something about the confidence required to carry one. Above these stood the sword, and a sword was a different order of object entirely. It required a great deal of high-quality iron and enormous skill to make. The finest examples were pattern welded, built from rods of iron of differing carbon content, twisted together and forge welded, producing a blade with a hard edge, a flexible core, and a rippling herringbone figure in the metal that was polished and etched to be seen. Such a weapon cost the equivalent of a small farm. It was inherited, named, described in poetry, and buried with its owner. A particular group of blades carries the inlaid name Ulfbert in iron letters. More than 150 have been found across northern Europe, spanning 2 centuries, which means it functioned rather like a brand. Several are made of crucible steel, of a purity that European metallurgy could not produce at the time, and the raw material almost certainly came along the eastern trade routes from Central Asia. Counterfeits exist too, with the name misspelled and the metal inferior, which may be the earliest documented case of trademark piracy in European history. For defense, the shield was universal, round, roughly 80 to 90 centimeters across, made of thin planks of spruce, fir or pine glued and pegged together, with a hole in the center covered by an iron boss that protected the hand gripping the bar behind it. The face was covered in leather or linen and painted, and the rim was bound in rawhide or leather. Contrary to the impression left by museum displays, these shields were not heavy or ponderous. They were light, mobile, and designed to be used actively, catching blows on the angle and binding an opponent's weapon, and they broke frequently. Laws in Norway specified how many shields a ship's crew must carry, precisely because they were consumable. Body armor was a mark of wealth. A mail shirt of interlinked iron rings, perhaps 30,000 of them, each one cut, coiled, closed, and often riveted by hand, represented months of specialist labor. Only the well-off had one. Others wore thick, padded or layered garments, or leather, or nothing but wool. As for helmets, they were less common than films suggest, and follow a simple pattern, a rounded iron cap, sometimes with a nose guard or spectacle-shaped eye protection. And no, there were no horns. Not one horned helmet from the Viking Age has ever been found. The idea comes from the 19th century, from a costume designer working on the first complete production of Wagner's Ring Cycle in 1876, who dressed the singers in horned helmets to suggest primitive northern barbarism. Romantic painters took it up, and it has proved impossible to dislodge. There are Bronze Age horned helmets from Denmark, more than 1,000 years earlier and ceremonial in purpose, but nothing from the age we are discussing. Practically speaking, a horn on a helmet is an invitation for an opponent to hook it and pull your head down. In the field, the standard formation was the shield wall. Men stood shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlapping, spears braced, the line perhaps several ranks deep, and the two walls advanced until they met. What followed was a shoving, stabbing, exhausting contest in which the crucial factor was not individual heroics, but whether the line held. Battles were often decided when one wall broke and men began to run, and it was in the pursuit that most of the killing occurred. The sources mention a wedge formation, said to have been taught by Odin himself, in which the strongest men formed a point to punch through an enemy line. Whether it was used as often as the literature implies is uncertain, which brings us to the berserkers. The word appears to mean either bear shirt or bear shirt, and the scholarly disagreement between those two readings has never quite been resolved. The sagas describe warriors who worked themselves into a state of frenzy before battle, howling, biting the rims of their shields, becoming insensible to pain and wounds, then collapsing into exhaustion afterwards. Related figures called Ulfhethnar, wolfcoats, are associated with Odin. How much of this is real? Some of it, probably. A state of extreme battle rage is well documented in many cultures, and ritual preparation and the psychology of a warrior band could plausibly produce it. Popular explanations involving hallucinogenic mushrooms or henbane are speculative and have little supporting evidence. It is also striking that in the later sagas, berserkers usually appear as villains, marauding thugs whom the hero must kill, and Iceland eventually outlawed them, which suggests that ordinary Norse society regarded uncontrolled violence with the same dim view as anyone else. Tactically, the great Viking advantage was never in the pitched battle. It was mobility. A fleet could appear on a coast without warning, strike a target, and be gone before the local levy could be summoned. And by the time an army arrived, the ships were 50 miles away, raiding somewhere else. Defenders were forced to protect everything at once, which is to say they could protect nothing. Armies that overwintered took horses at the first opportunity, not to fight from but to move at speed inland, and this combination of sea mobility and land mobility was the strategic heart of their success. Siegecraft was less impressive, at least early on. Storming a defended stone wall was not a northern speciality, and the record of assaults on fortified towns is mixed. What they learned instead was blockade, ruse, and patience, and by the 10th and 11th centuries, Scandinavian forces were operating siege equipment competently enough. Fortification at home is a subject that deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it reveals the growing power of kings. Across the neck of the Jutland Peninsula runs the Danevirke, a defensive earthwork with ditch and rampart, begun long before the Viking Age, and repeatedly enlarged, in places stretching for miles. Constructing and maintaining it required organized labor on a scale that implies real central authority. More striking still are the ring fortresses of late 10th century Denmark, Trelleborg, Furkat, Aggersborg, Nonnebakken, and others. Each is a perfect circle of earth ramparts, mathematically precise, with 4 gates at the compass points, a road crossing the interior, and identical boat-shaped longhouses arranged in squares within the quadrants. Their regularity is astonishing for the period, and it points unmistakably to a royal command with the resources and the ambition to impose a standard design across a kingdom. They were used for only a short period, and their exact purpose is debated. Royal garrisons, staging bases for an invasion of England, instruments for controlling a newly unified Denmark, or all three. Finally, there is the psychological dimension, and it is easy to overstate. Norse warriors did benefit from a reputation for ferocity, and reputation does part of the work of an army. since a town that believes resistance is hopeless surrenders and pays. The written record of that ferocity, though, comes almost entirely from the churchmen who were its victims, and who were also, understandably, its least neutral witnesses. Warfare in 9th century Europe was savage everywhere. Charlemagne's campaigns against the Saxons were as brutal as anything done at Lindisfarne. What made the Northerners exceptional was not cruelty but reach. Every age ends, and this one ended not with a single defeat, but with a slow transformation from within. Three forces did the work: a new religion, a new kind of kingship, and a changing economy. Christianity came north gradually and by many routes. Missionaries arrived early and achieved little at first. A Frankish monk named Ansgar preached in Denmark and Sweden in the 9th century, founded a church at Hedeby and another at Birka, and was politely tolerated rather than embraced. Far more effective were the ordinary channels of contact. Traders in Christian towns took a preliminary blessing, the prima signatio, so that they could do business with Christians without full baptism, a pragmatic halfway house that thousands of merchants used. Warriors serving Christian kings converted for advancement. Settlers in England, Ireland, and Normandy married Christian women and raised Christian children. Slaves brought back from Ireland and Britain were Christian, and slaves raised children. Then the kings converted, and everything accelerated, because in this society, religion followed authority. In Denmark, Harald Bluetooth accepted baptism around the year 965, after a missionary named Poppo reportedly carried a piece of red-hot iron without injury to prove the strength of his god. At Jelling in Jutland, Harald raised a great carved stone beside his parents' burial mounds. On one face, a figure of the crucified Christ is shown, bound in the interlacing style of Norse ornament, and the inscription declares that Harald won all Denmark and Norway for himself and made the Danes Christian. It is often called Denmark's birth certificate, and it is one of the most eloquent objects of the entire period. A king announcing a nation and a religion in the same breath, in runes, in the old style, about a new god. Norway's conversion was rougher. Olaf Tryggvason, a returned Viking who had raided England and been baptized there, took the throne in 995 and pursued conversion with violent enthusiasm, offering chieftains the choice between baptism and death, and destroying temples. He reigned 5 years and died at sea in battle. Olaf Haraldsson continued the work with equal force, was driven out by his own nobility in alliance with the Danes, returned, and was killed at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. Within a year of that defeat, reports of miracles at his grave began to circulate, and the king whom Norwegians had rejected became Saint Olaf, patron of the nation, and the conversion he could not complete by force was accomplished by his cult. Iceland managed things far more sensibly, and the episode is worth telling because it is so unlike everything else. In the year 1000, with the island dividing dangerously between Christians and pagans and civil war, a real possibility, the Althing asked the law speaker, a pagan priest named Thorgeir, to decide the matter for everyone. He went to his booth, lay down under his cloak and stayed there for a day and a night without speaking. When he rose, he announced that all should be baptized and the country should have one law, since a people divided by two customs could not keep the peace: private pagan sacrifice, the eating of horseflesh, and the exposure of unwanted infants, would be permitted quietly for a time. Both sides accepted. A national religion was changed by a legal argument and a night's reflection. Sweden took longest. The old sanctuary at Uppsala remained active well into the 11th century, and the country was not thoroughly Christian until the 12th. The religious change altered the terms of everything. Raiding a monastery is a different act when the monastery belongs to your own faith, and the abbot has dined with your father. Kings who ruled by God's grace could not easily fund themselves by robbing God's houses. Churches brought literacy, Latin, canon law, dioceses, tithes, and record-keeping, and each of those is an instrument of administration as much as of worship. Alongside them came the machinery of medieval European monarchy, and the old world of local chieftains and open-air assemblies began to give way to something more centralized, more taxed, and more permanent. At the same time, the money changed. Real coinage, minted by kings and valued by decree rather than by weight, replaced hack silver. Trade shifted towards regulated towns, and the profits of long-distance commerce became more reliably obtained through a market than through a raid. Yet before that transformation was complete, the age produced its most spectacular achievements, and they came from Denmark. Sweyn Forkbeard, son of Harald Bluetooth, deposed his father and then turned his attention to England, which under King Ethelred was paying vast sums in tribute to keep Danish fleets away. Those payments, the Dangeld, ran into tens of thousands of pounds of silver, and the number of English coins found in Scandinavian soil, far exceeding the number found in England itself, shows exactly where that silver went. In 1002, Ethelred ordered the killing of Danes living in England, an atrocity known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre, which historians consider one of the more catastrophic decisions of his reign. Sweyn's response was sustained war. By 1013, the English had submitted, and Ethelred had fled to Normandy. Sweyn died a few weeks later. His son was 19, and he would become the most powerful ruler in northern Europe. Canute the Great secured England after a hard campaign, and then did something his father had not attempted. He governed it well. He married Emma of Normandy, the widow of the king he had displaced, keeping Norman ambitions at a distance and giving his rule continuity. He issued law codes drawing on English tradition. He supported the church generously, went on pilgrimage to Rome and attended the coronation of the emperor there, negotiating better terms for English and Danish merchants and pilgrims on the way. He kept English advisors, ruled through English institutions, and gave England something it had not enjoyed for a generation, which was peace. At his height, he ruled England, Denmark, and Norway, with influence in Sweden, a North Sea empire held together by ships and by his own considerable political skill. It did not survive him. His sons quarreled, died young, and by 1042, the English throne had passed back to Ethelred's son, Edward, called the Confessor. The story most people know about Canute is the one about the tide, and it is almost always told backwards. The original account has him ordering the sea to halt, not out of arrogance, but to demonstrate to his flattering courtiers that the power of kings is worthless beside the power of God, after which he refused to wear his crown again. Whether it happened is uncertain. The moral it was meant to carry is clear enough. And so we arrive at the year that ends the age, and at a stretch of ground beside a river in Yorkshire. When Edward the Confessor died childless in January of 1066, 3 men claimed England. Harald Godwinson, the most powerful earl in the country, was crowned immediately. William, Duke of Normandy, descendant of Rollo, insisted the throne had been promised to him, and Harald Hardrada of Norway, the former Varangian, now in his 50s, and a king of long and violent experience, asserted a claim inherited from Canute's dynasty, and prepared to take it by force. Hardrada sailed in September with a fleet estimated at around 300 ships, joined by Harald Godwinson's own exiled brother Tostig. They landed in Yorkshire, defeated the northern earls at Fulford, and took York. Then they withdrew to Stamford Bridge to await hostages and supplies, and in the warm weather, many of them left their mail with the ships. Harald Godwinson marched north from London with his household troops, covering roughly 200 miles in 4 days, and arrived without warning. The Norwegians saw a dust cloud, then the glint of weapons in it, and understood far too late what was approaching. The battle that followed was long and desperate. Norse tradition preserves the image of a lone axeman holding the bridge itself against the English advance until he was killed from beneath. Hardrada fought without armor, in the frenzy the sagas call the Storm of the Fury, and was struck in the throat by an arrow. Tostig died too. The Norwegian army was destroyed so completely that the survivors, given quarter, needed only 24 ships to carry them home, out of the 300 that had come. It was one of the most decisive victories in English history, and it ruined the victor. 3 days later, the wind in the channel changed, and William landed on the south coast at Pevensey. Harald turned his exhausted army around and marched south again, gathering men as he went, and on the 14th of October, he met the Normans on a ridge near Hastings. His shield wall held for most of the day against cavalry and archery, and then it broke, and he died with it. There is a symmetry in that autumn which no storyteller would dare invent. In 1 month, the last great Viking king of the old kind died attempting a conquest in the old style, and a descendant of Vikings who had become entirely French succeeded by entirely different means. The age closed with a Norseman on either side of it. So what remained, when the ships stopped coming? More than almost anyone realizes, and much of it is hiding in plain sight in the language you are listening to now. Old Norse and Old English were related tongues, close enough that speakers could probably make themselves understood with effort, and when Scandinavian settlers and English villagers lived side by side across the Danelaw for generations, the two languages mingled in a way that is quite unusual. Ordinarily, a conquered population borrows grand words from its rulers: government, justice, cuisine, the vocabulary of the powerful. That is what happened after the Norman conquest. What happened with Norse was different. English absorbed the ordinary words, the domestic ones, the words people use when they are not being careful. Consider a few: sky, skin, skirt, egg, knife, window, from a word meaning wind-eye, husband, anger, bag, cake, dirt, fog, gift, happy, leg, loose, muck, odd, rotten, same, seat, ugly, want, weak, wrong. Law itself is a Norse word, and so is outlaw, and so is bylaw, and so is ransack, and so is berserk. To call, to crawl, to cut, to die, to drag, to get, to give, to lift, to raise, to scare, to take, to thrive, to trust. Even the pronouns they, them, and their came from Norse, replacing the native English forms, and it is rare for a language to borrow something so structural. The days of the week carry the gods themselves. Tuesday belongs to Tyr, the one-handed god of oaths, who put his hand into the wolf's mouth as a pledge and lost it. Wednesday is Woden's day, the same figure as Odin. Thursday is Thor's. Friday is Frigg's, or possibly Freyja's, and scholars have argued about which for a very long time. The map is Norse too, every English place name ending in by or thorpe or thwaite. Every Scottish name ending in I, meaning island, from Orkney to Islay. The Yorkshire Dales, where gill means a ravine, and beck means a stream, and fell means a hill, all Norse words still in daily use. Dublin, Wexford and Waterford, the Normandy coastline, Russ itself, in the names of two modern nations. Legal and political inheritance runs equally deep. The word thing survives in the Norwegian storting, the Icelandic althing, the Danish folketing. The Tynwald on the Isle of Man still assembles in the open air each July, its officers reading the year's new laws aloud in English and Manx to whoever attends, as its predecessors did 1,000 years ago. In England, the idea of trial by a jury of neighbours and the administrative division of Yorkshire into ridings, from a Norse word meaning thirds, both carry Scandinavian fingerprints. Then there is the sea. Ship terminology in English is thick with Norse. keel, mast, rudder from a steering board on the right side of the vessel, which is why we still say starboard. The whole northern tradition of clinker-built boat building continued in Scandinavia, Britain and the Baltic for centuries, and small working boats on the Norwegian coast today are recognizably descended from the vessels in the burial mounds. Archaeology keeps adding to the picture, and the pace has not slowed. The Skuld ships were raised in the 1960s, and their replicas have since sailed to Dublin and back. The great Viking hoard found at Quairdale in Lancashire in the 19th century contained more than 8,000 items of silver, most of it linked to the Dublin Norse. Metal detectorists across England have transformed the map of Scandinavian activity there, revealing large camps, such as the one at Torksey in Lincolnshire, where the Great Army wintered, complete with gaming pieces, weights, hack silver, and workshop debris. Excavations at Coppergate in York uncovered whole streets of 10th century timber buildings, preserved with their leatherwork, textiles, and even the parasites in the cesspits, which tells us rather more about daily life than anyone strictly wanted to know. Genetics has joined the conversation more recently, and its findings have been humbling for the old story. A large study published in 2020 analyzed genomes from hundreds of Viking-age skeletons across Europe, and it complicated everything. It confirmed substantial Scandinavian ancestry in parts of Britain and Ireland, and it also showed that people buried with full Viking rites were often not Scandinavian at all, and that Scandinavian populations themselves carried significant ancestry from southern Europe and from the east. Some individuals buried in a boat grave in Orkney were genetically local. Being a Viking, on this evidence, was rather more a matter of what you did and how you lived than of where your grandparents were born. That finding leads naturally to the misconceptions, and it is worth clearing away a few before we close. The word Viking was not an ethnic label. In Old Norse, it referred to an activity, going on a Viking expedition, and most Scandinavians never went on one. Calling the whole population Vikings is a little like calling the whole population of a modern country pirates, because a minority of them once put to sea. They were not uniquely dirty. They combed their hair, changed their clothes and bathed weekly, and the English complained about it. They did not wear horned helmets, as we have seen, and they did not drink from the skulls of their enemies. That colorful detail comes from a 17th century mistranslation of a poetic phrase about drinking from curved horns. They were not purely destroyers. They founded Dublin, Waterford, Limerick and Cork, made York into one of the great commercial centers of northern Europe, opened trade routes that reached from Newfoundland to Baghdad, and built states in Normandy, Sicily, and along the Russian rivers. Nor, however, were they the misunderstood merchant farmers that a well-meaning reaction sometimes suggests. They raided, they burned, they killed, and they trafficked human beings on a large scale for 2 centuries. Both descriptions are true simultaneously, and the difficulty of holding two true things together is the ordinary condition of studying the past. And they were emphatically not the first Europeans to think of themselves as a nation of any kind. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, as we understand them, were created during and by this period, not before it. Consider, as we come towards the end, what an unlikely history this is. A scattering of farms on the edge of the habitable world, on land that offered stone, cold water, and a short summer. A society with no cities, no writing beyond short inscriptions carved on stone, no coinage of its own, no bureaucracy, and no army in any organized sense. And out of that, within roughly 3 centuries, came the discovery of Iceland and Greenland, the first European landing in the Americas, the founding of Dublin, the reshaping of England, the creation of Normandy, and through it, the transformation of England again, the establishment of the Rus, the bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors, and a trading network that carried silver from Samarkand to a farmhouse in a Norwegian fjord. They achieved it with wood, wool, iron, and nerve. What strikes me most, thinking about them at the end of a long night's telling, is the relationship between their worldview and their behavior. Here were people who believed that the date of their death was already decided, that the gods themselves would lose the final battle, that the world would end in fire and water, and that nothing could prevent it. That belief might reasonably have produced despair. Instead, it produced the opposite. If the ending is fixed and cannot be argued with, then the only thing left that belongs to you is how you conduct yourself on the way there, and whether the story told about you afterwards is one you would be content to hear. Cattle die, the old poem says. Kinsmen die. You yourself will die. One thing alone will never die, and that is the reputation of a man who has earned a good one. They were not gentle people, and I would not want to romanticize them. Ask the monks of Lindisfarne, or the families sold in the markets of the Volga. Yet there is something in that clear-eyed acceptance of an ending, combined with a refusal to let it make life smaller, that is worth carrying out of the 10th century and into a quiet room in the 21st. So let the fjords go now. Let the sail come down, and the oars go still. Let the hall settle, the fire sink to embers, the cattle breathe in the dark beyond the partition. Somewhere, a ship is drawn up on a shingle beach with the tide going out around it, and the sky over the northern sea is turning that long, slow blue that never quite becomes night. Come back gently, back across the water, back through the centuries, into your own room, your own bed, your own warmth, in a world these people helped to shape without ever knowing it. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. If you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to let me know in the comments where you're listening from in the world. I'd also love to hear which civilization or historical period you'd like me to explore next. And if you have any suggestions for how I can make these documentaries even better, I'd genuinely love to hear them. Until next time, sleep into power, guys. Good night.